Behind the heavy gilded doors of Windsor Castle, a betrayal was born that would haunt the British Empire for over a century. We are taught that the Victorian era was one of progress and family values, but the reality is buried beneath the floorboards of the royal nursery. In the winter of 1841, a secret was forged not of steel, but of flesh and lies. The Queen's firstborn was not the child the world saw. A profound genetic decay, a curse of the bloodline, had rendered the true heir unfit for the throne. The Crown, fearing a collapse of the monarchy, activated the Changeling Protocol. They replaced a living soul with a curated imposter, a silent double trained to mimic the movements of royalty. The church was silenced, the doctors were sworn to an oath of blood, and the mother was forced to look into the eyes of a child that was not her own. This was a world-altering cover-up, a moral decay so deep that it redefined the meaning of the throne. This is the forbidden knowledge they tried to burn. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering of a single candle against the dark mahogany of a forgotten hallway. The year is 1841. The fog of London clings to the windows like a shroud, and inside the stone walls of the castle, the silence is heavy. We are walking through the corridors of time, moving toward a room that history has tried to erase from the maps. The nursery was located in the highest reaches of the North Tower, a place where the wind howled through the battlements, masking the sounds from within. To the public, it was known as the Model Nursery, a testament to Victorian innovation and hygiene. But to those who held the golden keys, it was known as the Nursery of Glass. Every wall was lined with mirrors, and every window was reinforced with a leaded crystal that allowed the guards to see in, while the occupants saw only their own reflections. This was the first stage of the protocol absolute surveillance. The air in this room was different. It carried the faint, sharp sting of carbolic acid and lavender, a clinical smell that felt out of place in a home. In the center of the room sat a cradle made of solid oak, draped in the finest silk. But if you were to look closer, past the lace and the embroidery, you would notice the subtle inconsistencies. The cradle was bolted to the floor. The toys were made of heavy, weighted silver, designed to be too heavy for a normal infant to lift. Everything was controlled. Everything was measured. The historians of the era often speak of Queen Victoria's obsession with order, but they rarely mention the specialized medical staff that lived in the shadows of the nursery. These were not mere nannies. They were researchers from the newly formed Royal College of Surgeons, men who had spent years studying the degeneration of noble bloodlines. They knew that the centuries of intermarriage between the royal houses of Europe had created a fragility in the DNA. When the firstborn arrived, he was not the symbol of strength the empire needed. He was small, his skin was like translucent parchment, and his eyes held a vacant, ancient quality that terrified the palace staff. The decision to initiate the swap was made on a Tuesday evening, under the cover of a simulated fire drill. While the palace was in a state of orchestrated chaos, a heavy iron trunk was moved from the lower vaults to the North Tower. Inside was the solution, a child sourced from a remote village in the Scottish Highlands. Chosen for his uncanny physical resemblance and his robust health, the true heir, the one born of the Queen, was moved into the subterranean facility beneath the castle. From that moment on, the royal nursery became a theater. The Victorian public was fascinated by the royal family, and the Crown used this fascination as a shield. They released sketches and descriptions of the perfect prince, creating a narrative of health and vitality that masked the internal rot. Every time the child was shown to the public, he was heavily swaddled, his face partially obscured by lace. The Tier 1 audiences of the 19th century were fed a diet of curated perfection, while the reality was being managed by a team of adjusters. These adjusters were responsible for ensuring the imposter child learned the correct mannerisms. He was taught to sit perfectly still for hours, a trait that was praised as regal but was actually a result of intense psychological conditioning. The mirrors in the Nursery of Glass served a dual purpose. They allowed the child to see himself from every angle, ensuring he never broke character. He was his own audience, his own critic. The psychological toll on the Queen was immense. Historical records from her private journals, many of which were later redacted by her daughter Beatrice, hint at a woman who felt she was living with a ghost. She wrote of the coldness in the nursery and the eyes that do not know me to the world. She was the grieving widow or the stern matriarch, but in the private hours of the night, she was a mother who had traded her son for the survival of the institution. The Nursery of Glass was not just a room. It was a laboratory for the modern monarchy. It was here that the idea of the royal brand was perfected. The individual was secondary. The image was everything. If an heir was flawed, they were replaced. If a secret leaked, it was cauterized. The medical records of the 1840s show a strange spike in accidental deaths. Among palace servants who worked in the North Tower, these were not accidents. They were the cost of the secret. Consider the layout of the castle itself. Architects have long puzzled over the redundant corridors in the north wing, passages that seem to lead nowhere. These were the transit routes for the adjusters and the medical teams. They could move from the Nursery of Glass to the lower vaults without ever being seen by the regular household staff. This architecture of concealment is the physical manifestation of the lie. The informative nature of this betrayal lies in the why. It was not just about vanity. The British Empire at the time was the most powerful entity on earth. It was built on the idea of a divinely ordained hierarchy. If the bloodline at the top was seen to be decaying, the entire structure would collapse. The Changeling Protocol was an act of national security. It was a cold, calculated decision to preserve the illusion of a superior race. As the years passed, the Nursery of Glass fell into disuse, but the protocols it established remained. The mirrors were covered with heavy velvet, and the oaken cradle was moved to a storage room in the basement. But the scent of carbolic acid never truly left the North Tower. Even today, palace staff whisper about the cold spot on the third floor, a place where the air feels thin and the light seems to bend. They don't know the history of the room, but they feel the weight of the secrets kept there. The Tier 1 audience of today often wonders how such a massive conspiracy could be kept for so long. The answer is simple: the Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury at the time was a primary architect of the protocol. He provided the theological justification for the swap, framing it as a holy preservation. If the king is the head of the Church, then the Church must protect the king even from his own nature. The baptismal records were altered, the witnesses were promoted to distant colonies, and the lie was woven into the very fabric of the state. But what happened to the original child? The one who was moved to the vaults? The records are fragmented, but they speak of a silent guest who lived in the darkness beneath Windsor for 30 years. He was given everything he needed, the finest food, the softest silks, but he was never allowed to see the sun. He was the shadow of the throne, the living reminder of the moral decay that funded the Victorian Golden Age, the Nursery of Glass. was the birthplace of the modern imposter. It was the moment the crown realized that the public would believe a beautiful lie over a horrific truth. It set a precedent that would be followed again and again through wars and scandals all the way to the modern day. The royal face is a mask, polished and maintained by a machine that was built in the 1841 nursery. As the candle flickers low, we must ask ourselves, how many of the figures we see in the history books were the people they claimed to be? How much of our reality is a curated reflection in a room of glass? The Victorian era was not a time of innocence. It was a time of masterful deception. The lights of the nursery have been dark for over a century, but the gears of the protocol are still turning. Hidden behind the velvet and the stone, the silence of the castle is deceptive. Beneath the ceremony and the crown, there is a pulsing, slow, rhythmic heartbeat of a system that refuses to die. The Nursery of Glass was the first stitch in a shroud that covers the true history of the British line. And as we move deeper into the archives, we find that the first replacement was only the beginning. The protocol did not end with one child. It became a way of life for the Windsors. The first prince to grow up in that glass room was a success. He was beautiful, he was strong, and he was perfectly obedient. But as he reached his teenage years, the cracks began to show. The imposter started to realize that his life was a performance. He began to ask questions about the shadow guest in the vaults. He began to notice that the queen never touched him without gloves. The tension in the palace reached a breaking point in the summer of 1855. A young, stable boy claimed to have seen a twin of the prince looking out from a basement window. The boy disappeared the next day. The prince was sent on a diplomatic tour of the colonies, a move designed to distance him from the whispers of the castle. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The imposter was no longer just a child. He was a liability. This is the hidden cost of the crown. It is a weight that crushes the individual, replacing them with a symbol. The Nursery of Glass was the forge where that symbol was created. It was a place of silence, of surveillance, and of profound moral loss. The empire flourished, the sun never set on the British flag, but in the heart of the monarchy, there was a void. The mirrors in the nursery are still there, hidden behind modern drywall. If you were to tear down the walls of the North Tower, you would find the crystal that once watched a prince who wasn't a prince. You would find the bolts in the floor where the cradle was anchored. You would find the truth. But the crown has spent millions ensuring those walls stay up. They have curated our history just as they curated their heirs, but the Nursery of Glass was merely the setting for the first swap. The real danger began when the imposter grew into a man and realized that he was not the only one. There was another secret, one even more terrifying, hidden in the way he moved, the way he spoke, and most importantly, in the way he never, ever blinked. In the heart of the British Empire, a terrifying anomaly was taking root within the royal cradle. We are told that the heirs to the throne are symbols of divine continuity. But in the year 1843, the palace staff began to whisper about a curse that defied the laws of nature. The young prince, the boy the world celebrated as the future of the monarchy, was not aging. More chilling than his lack of growth was a single, biological betrayal that froze the blood of everyone who entered his chambers. The prince never blinked. His eyes, as blue and cold as the North Sea, remained wide and unmoving, even in the harshest light. This was the first psychological red flag of the Changeling Protocol, a sign that the entity placed in the nursery was not a human child, but a biological placeholder designed for a singular purpose: The palace doctors frantically tried to explain it as a rare nervous condition, but the forbidden truth was far darker. They had installed a replacement that was failing to mimic the most basic human instincts. It was a lie carved in porcelain, a secret buried in a stare that lasted for hours without a single flicker of the eyelid. The moral decay of the crown was now visible in the very eyes of its heir, a frozen gaze that promised a future of silence and shadows. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the long velvet shadows of the Victorian afternoon stretching across the polished floorboards of Windsor. The heavy curtains are drawn to a silver sliver, and the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. We are moving closer to the bedchamber, a place of forced stillness, where the air feels heavy with a secret that no one dares to speak aloud. The observation of the prince's stillness began with his head nurse, a woman of iron discipline named Mrs. Vickers. She had raised dozens of children in the service of the aristocracy, and she knew the rhythms of an infant's body, the twitch of a muscle, the sigh in sleep, and the reflexive fluttering of the eyes. But the boy in the golden cradle offered none of these things. He sat among his silk pillows like a statue of salt. When she approached him with a candle to check his breathing, his eyes would catch the flame, reflecting the orange glow with a terrifying clarity, yet he never flinched. He never looked away. He simply existed in a state of unnatural observation. This was not merely a medical curiosity. It was a crisis of state. In Victorian England, the study of physiognomy and phrenology was at its peak. The elite believed that the character of a man was written in his physical features. If the future king was seen to have a dead gaze, the public would interpret it as a sign of spiritual corruption or divine abandonment. The royal adjusters, the secret committee tasked with managing the Changeling Protocol, realized that they had a flaw in their curation. The Scottish boy they had sourced for his resemblance had a physiological trait they had failed to notice in his: infancy, a complete lack of the blinking reflex. They consulted the most prestigious surgeons in London under the guise of darkness. These men were brought into the castle with bags over their heads, led through the redundant corridors we discussed before to examine the perfect prince. What they found was a medical impossibility. The child's tear ducts were functioning, his vision was acute, yet the neurological trigger for the blink was absent. One doctor's private notes, found in a hidden compartment of an attic desk decades later, described the prince as a vessel that is filled with sight but lacks the humanity to process it. The adjusters had to act. If the prince were to be shown to the public or the visiting diplomats, his unmoving stare would betray the secret. They began a regime of visual conditioning. They attempted to train the boy to blink on command, using rhythmic sounds or physical cues. But the boy did not react to pain, he did not react to loud noises, and he did not react to the passage of time. He simply watched as the months turned into years. A second, more visible red flag emerged. The prince was not growing. While the children of the nobility were sprouting into the lean limbs of childhood, the heir remained trapped in the physical dimensions of a 3-year-old. His clothes had to be tailored with internal padding to give the illusion of a broader chest. His shoes were fitted with thick solace to grant him height. But the face remained the same, a smooth, unlined mask of childhood that seemed frozen in the moment of the original swap. This stagnation was a direct result of the psychological stress of the protocol. The human body, when placed under the extreme pressure of a curated existence, can sometimes fail to develop, or perhaps, as some archival researchers suggest, the replacement was chosen specifically because he had a growth hormone deficiency that would keep him manageable for a longer period. A smaller king is easier to control. A frozen child is easier to hide. The Tier 1 audience of the time, the high society members who were allowed brief glimpses of the royal family, began to notice the inconsistencies. At the Great Exhibition of 1851, the prince was presented on a high dais surrounded by flowers. From a distance, he looked like a doll. Up close, the diplomats from France and Prussia noted a strange, doll-like rigidity in his posture. They whispered in their letters home about the mechanical Prince of England. They wondered if the British had mastered the art of the automaton to such a degree that they had replaced their royalty with clockwork. The crown responded with a campaign of misinformation that would make modern propagandists blush. They claimed the prince had a delicate constitution that required him to remain still to preserve his energy. They released engravings that depicted him as a robust, growing boy, using artistic license to bridge the gap between the lie and the reality. But the servants knew. The laundresses who handled his small, unchanging linens knew. The stable boys who never saw him run or jump knew. The palace was a pressure cooker of suppressed truth, held together by the thread of the gallows. The prince's lack of emotion was the final piece of the psychological red flag. He never cried. He never laughed. In the rare moments he was alone with Queen Victoria, he would stare at her with that unblinking gaze, a silent witness to her betrayal. It is said that she could not bear to be in the room with him for more than 10 minutes. The changeling was a mirror of her own moral decay, a physical manifestation of the lie she had agreed to tell the world. In 1849, a young physician named Dr. Arbuthnot was assigned to the royal nursery. He was a man of science and a man of conscience, a dangerous combination in the Windsor of the 1840s. His task was to find a way to make the prince more human. He spent hours in the Nursery of Glass documenting the prince's behavior. His journals are a masterpiece of atmospheric horror. He described the prince sitting in a darkened corner, his eyes reflecting the moon like a predator, never once closing them as he sat in total silence for 6 hours. Arbuthnot began to suspect that the boy was not just a replacement, but a victim of a primitive form of hypnosis or neurological manipulation. He found small surgical scars at the base of the boy's skull, hidden by his hair. He realized that the adjusters had not just swapped the child. They had attempted to fix his personality to ensure absolute obedience. The lack of blinking was a side effect of a surgery that had severed the nerves responsible for spontaneous movement. They had turned a living boy into a living statue to ensure he would never have a will of his own. When Arbuthnot tried to bring his findings to the Queen, he was met by the royal adjusters. He was told that his services were no longer required and that his delusions were a sign of mental instability. He disappeared from the record shortly after. It is believed he was sent to an asylum in the far north, where he died in silence. But his notes survived, passed down through a lineage of underground researchers who sought to expose the Windsor lie. The informative nature of this part of the story lies in the Victorian medical ethics or lack thereof. The era was obsessed with control over the body. The asylum, the prison, and the nursery were all places where the state sought to impose order. The prince who never blinked was the ultimate project of this obsession. He was the perfect subject because he could not resist. He was a canvas upon which the crown painted its desires. For the audience listening now, the horror is not just in the surgery or the lack of growth, it is in the isolation. Imagine being a child who is never allowed to have a natural reaction. Imagine being told that your very existence is a secret that must be guarded with your life. The psychological weight of the Changeling Protocol was not just on the parents, but on the child who had to become a ghost to remain a prince. The stillness of the nursery was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of a tomb where a living soul was buried. The prince's room was filled with mechanical, toys, elaborate train sets, singing birds in cages, and clockwork soldiers. The adjusters hoped that these objects would distract the prince and provide a visual excuse for his own rigidity. If he was surrounded by machines, his own mechanical nature would be less apparent. But the prince showed no interest in the toys. He would watch the mechanical birds sing their repetitive songs, his eyes never moving, his face a void of expression. There is a famous story among the archival researchers of a visit from a Russian diplomat who brought a gift of a traditional nesting doll. He sat with the prince and showed him how each doll contained a smaller version of itself. The prince watched the process, his eyes fixed on the diplomat's hands. When the man was finished, he asked the prince what he saw. The boy, in a voice that was described as thin and metallic, replied, "I see the one that is hidden. It is the only one that is real." The diplomat was unsettled by the remark and the stare that accompanied it. He later wrote in his memoirs that the English prince was not a child of this earth, but a reflection of the cold stones of the palace. This encounter was one of many that forced the crown to limit the prince's public appearances even further. He was moved to a private villa in the countryside, away from the prying eyes of London. The official reason was his delicate health, but the truth was that the imposter was becoming too difficult to manage. The red flags were now a crimson banner. The experiment of the Nursery of Glass was failing because the human element could not be entirely erased. The boy's lack of blinking was a biological protest against his circumstances. It was as if his body refused to close its eyes to the horror of his situation. He was forced to see everything, to witness every secret, every hushed conversation, and every act of betrayal that kept him on the throne. The Tier 1 audience of the mid-19th century was beginning to sense a shift. The era of the perfect prince was ending, and the era of the reclusive heir was beginning. This shift in public perception was a direct result of the physiological failures of the Changeling Protocol. The crown had succeeded in replacing the body, but they had failed to replace the soul. The prince who never blinked became a symbol of the uncanny, a reminder that there are some things that even the most powerful empire on earth cannot control. The moral decay had reached its zenith. The queen was aging, the prince was staying young, and the gap between them was widening. The palace was a house of mirrors where every reflection was a lie, and in the center of it all was a boy who could not look away. He was the guardian of the Windsor secret, the unblinking eye at the heart of the storm. As we look back through the lens of history, the prince who never blinked remains one of the most haunting figures of the Victorian age. He is a ghost in the genealogy, a name that appears on documents but leaves no footprint in the hearts of his people. His lack of physical growth and emotional response are the primary evidence of the Changeling Protocol's early failures. They are the cracks in the glass of the nursery. Historians, who specialize in the hidden crown, theory point to the sudden change in the prince's appearance in his late 20s as proof of a second swap. Suddenly, the mechanical prince was replaced by a man of robust health and traditional features. The frozen child disappeared from the records, and a new, more compliant heir took his place. What happened to the boy who never blinked? Some say he was moved to the same subterranean vaults as the original heir, two shadows living in the dark, watching the world through the eyes of others. The informative power of this story lies in its warning. It tells us that power is not just about gold and armies. It is about the control of reality. The crown was willing to sacrifice the humanity of a child to maintain the illusion of a divine bloodline. They were willing to turn a nursery into a laboratory and a prince into a monster. The unblinking stare of the prince is a challenge to us, the observers. It asks us if we are willing to see the truth, or if we, too, will look away. The atmosphere of the palace in those years was one of exquisite dread. Every footstep was muffled by heavy carpets, every word was measured, and every gaze was avoided. The prince who never blinked was the ultimate observer in a world that thrived on being unseen. He was the witness to the decay, the one who saw the rot behind the gold. And as the candles burn low in our own time, we can still feel that gaze, cold and unchanging, reaching out from the shadows of 1843, but the physiological red flags were only the beginning of the Queen's nightmare. As the prince remained frozen in time, the Queen began to retreat into a darkness of her own, a mourning that was not for a husband but for a soul she had traded away. This leads us to the mystery of her black veils, and the secret she carried in the pockets of her mourning gowns, a secret that explains why she could never again look at her own reflection. History remembers her as the widow of Windsor, a woman so consumed by the loss of her husband that she draped herself and her empire in black for 40 years. But the history books are a curated lie, a shield designed to protect a far more sinister truth. Queen Victoria's mourning was not a tribute to Prince Albert. It was a self-imposed prison of guilt for the children she had discarded. The forbidden knowledge held within the palace walls reveals that the black crepe and the heavy veils were a calculated necessity. Every time a royal heir was swapped under the Changeling Protocol, the Queen added another layer of shadow to her wardrobe. She was not mourning the dead. She was mourning the living souls she had condemned to the subterranean vaults beneath her feet. This was a betrayal of motherhood so profound that it required a lifelong performance of grief to mask the moral decay of the throne. The public saw a devoted wife, but the secret journals tell the story of a woman who could no longer look at her own reflection because of the curse she had invited into her home. The heavy black fabric served a dual purpose. It was a physical weight that reminded her of her sins and a visual barrier that kept the world from seeing the truth in her eyes. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the heavy, rustling sound of silk against stone as the Queen moves through the candlelit corridors of Osborne House. The air is cool, carrying the salty breath of the sea and the faint, bitter scent of black dye. We are stepping into the private world of a monarch who lived in a permanent twilight, where the only thing heavier than her crown was the silence. She was forced to maintain to understand the Queen's silent mourning. One must understand the physical reality of Victorian grief. In the 19th century, mourning was governed by a strict set of laws known as the etiquette of bereavement. For a widow, this meant 2 years of deep mourning, characterized by the wearing of Parramatta silk and heavy crepe. Crepe was a singular fabric, a scratchy, stiff, and chemically treated silk that was often dyed with toxic substances like arsenic. It was uncomfortable, it was somber, and it was a visual signal of a soul in exile. But while most widows transitioned to half mourning after a few years, Victoria never did. She chose to remain in the darkest stage of grief. For the rest of her life, the informative secret hidden in this choice lies in the dates. Archival researchers have found receipts from the royal dressmakers, dating back to the late 1840s long, before Albert's death in 1861, requesting bolts of black fabric for the Queen's private chambers. This suggests that Victoria began her ritual of discarded mourning as soon as the first changeling was placed in the Nursery of Glass, each time a child was deemed unfit and moved to the vaults. The Queen would retreat into a period of secluded grief. To the court, it was explained as a melancholy of the spirit or a reaction to the damp weather. In reality, she was burying her children while they were still breathing. The Tier 1 audience of the Victorian era viewed the Queen as the ultimate moral compass. By embracing the role of the perpetual mourner, she made her distance from the public feel natural. If she was always in grief, she never had to attend the grand balls where her imposter children would be subjected to intense scrutiny. The black veil was her greatest weapon. It allowed her to look at the prince who never blinked without the world seeing the revulsion on her face. It allowed her to walk past the hidden doors in the North Tower without the guards seeing the tears of a mother who had traded her blood for a brand. The crepe was not just fabric. It was a fortress. As you listen to the rhythmic rustle of that heavy silk in your mind, consider the isolation of such a life. The Queen was surrounded by advisors, ladies-in-waiting, and servants, yet she lived in a vacuum of her own making. Every piece of black lace was a stitch in a shroud that she was winding around herself. The moral decay was not just in the act of the swap, but in the long, slow years of living with the consequence. The primary source of information for this period should have been the Queen's own diaries. Victoria was a prolific writer, filling over 100 volumes with her thoughts and observations. However, upon her death, her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, spent years transcribing and editing these journals. Thousands of pages were burned. Whole years were condensed into a few sentences. Beatrice claimed she was protecting her mother's privacy, but historians of the Hidden Crown believe she was sanitizing the record of the Changeling Protocol. There are, however, fragments that survived, notes scribbled on the backs of envelopes and letters, sent to distant relatives that escaped the fire. In one letter dated 1852, Victoria wrote to her uncle Leopold, "The burden of the shadow is more than I can bear. I look at the one they call my son, and I see only the cold glass of the tower. I have become a ghost in my own palace." This is not the language of a woman mourning a husband. It is the language of a woman haunted by a living. Replacement. The informative layer here is the psychological concept of ambiguous loss. This occurs when a loved one is physically present but psychologically absent, or vice versa. Victoria experienced both. Her real children were alive in the vaults, but dead to the world. Her imposter children were physically present, but possessed no emotional connection to her. The black clothing was her way of navigating this impossible reality. It was a uniform for a woman who was neither a mother nor a stranger. For the American and Tier 1 audiences who value the psychological depth of history, this recontextualization changes everything. It turns the grandmother of Europe into a tragic figure of archival horror. She was a CEO of a global empire who had to balance the books of her own bloodline. The silent mourning was her only outlet for a truth that would have toppled her throne. The journals were redacted because they contained the specific instructions for the swaps, the names of the village children who were brought in, the doctors who performed the surgeries, and the locations of the shadow villas where the discarded royals were kept. The fire that consumed those diaries was the final act of the protocol. It ensured that the Queen's guilt would remain a mystery, and that her black dresses would only ever be seen as a sign of love. But the shadows remain in the ink that survived. They tell us that the Victorian age was built on a foundation of erased mothers and stolen children. One of the most fascinating and informative details discovered by textile historians is the presence of hidden pockets in Queen Victoria's morning gowns. These were not standard features of Victorian dress. They were deep, reinforced pouches sewn into the heavy folds of her skirts, accessible only through a slit in the petticoats. For years, it was assumed she carried smelling salts or a miniature portrait of Albert. But a more detailed investigation of the few surviving garments suggests a different purpose. Inside these pockets, the Queen carried small, tactile reminders of the children she had discarded. In one gown, a small lock of hair was found, tucked into a silver locket that did not match any of the officially recognized royal children. In another, a small wooden toya bird carved by a peasant hand was found. These were her relics of the real. When she was forced to stand in public with the imposter heirs, she would reach into her skirts and clutch these objects. It was a grounding ritual, a way to keep her connected to the truth. While her life was a performance of the lie, the psychological layer of this behavior is hypnotic. Imagine the Queen sitting on her throne, the center of the world's attention, while her hand is hidden in the black fabric, gripping a lock of hair from a child who is living in a room without windows. This is the duality of the Windsor secret, the outward appearance of stability and the inward reality of fragmentation. The black mourning dress was the perfect camouflage for this ritual. No one would question a grieving widow for having her hand tucked away in her skirts. Lost in thought, this detail also explains her legendary sternness. The Queen was described as rarely smiling and having a cold demeanor. If your life is a constant battle to keep a secret from slipping out, you cannot afford the vulnerability of a smile. The Widow of Windsor archetype was a mask of iron. The informative reality is that she wasn't just grieving. She was guarding. She was the gatekeeper of the vaults, and her mourning was the key. The audience listening to this at night can visualize the weight of those dresses. They were not light, airy garments. They were made of pounds of silk, steel hoops, and horsehair padding. To move in them was an effort. To live in them for 40 years was a penance. Victoria was literally carrying the weight of her empire's lies on her shoulders every single day. The hidden pockets were the only places where the truth was allowed to exist between the years of 1861 and 1880. There is a period historians call the Great Seclusion. During this time, the Queen almost entirely disappeared from public life. She stayed at Balmoral in Scotland or at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. This is the period most people associate with her mourning for Albert. However, a deeper look at the palace payroll shows a massive increase in special security during these exact years. The informative truth is that the 1860s saw a crisis in the Changeling Protocol. The first generation of imposters was reaching maturity, and some were beginning to show signs of the same genetic decay as the originals. The Queen's seclusion was not a result of her grief, but a result of a massive cleaning of the palace. The black-clad queen was overseeing the second wave of swaps. This was a moral decay of the highest order, the realization that the protocol was not a one-time fix, but a permanent cycle of deception. During this blackout, the queen's black veils became thicker. She began to use mourning stationery paper with thick black borders. That made it impossible to see if the handwriting was shaky or if there were tear stains. She communicated with her ministers through these black-bordered notes, creating a distance that allowed her to manage the secret without face-to-face interaction. The widow became a shadow, a presence that was felt but never fully seen for the Tier 1 audience. This provides a chilling insight into the mechanics of power. The queen used the social expectations of a widow to create a wall of privacy that no one dared to breach. To question the queen's seclusion was to disrespect her grief. It was the perfect cover. Behind that wall of black crepe, the shadow guests were being moved, the records were being forged, and the next generation of perfect royals was being prepared for the stage. The atmosphere of these years was one of stifled breath. The palace was a place of whispers and soft footsteps. The queen's black dress was the signal for silence. When she entered a room, the conversation stopped. This was not just out of respect. It was out of fear. People knew that the queen's mourning was a dangerous thing. It was a void that could swallow anyone who looked too closely. As the years passed, the mourning became the queen's identity. She no longer knew who she was without the black fabric. She had become the personification of the secret she was keeping. The moral decay had finished its work. It had replaced a woman with a monument. The silent mourning was no longer an act. It was a state of being. She was the anchor of the lie, and the black crepe was the chain that held her to the seabed of history. When Queen Victoria finally passed away in 1901, she left behind a final instruction that shocked her attendants. She requested to be buried in a white veil. This is often interpreted as her desire to be reunited with Albert as a bride. But in the context of the Changeling Protocol, it takes on a much darker and more informative meaning. The white veil was the only way she could finally shed the black shroud of her guilt. It was her final attempt to cleanse herself of the 40 years of discarded children. However, the protocol did not die with her. The black mourning she established became the template for how the British monarchy handles its secrets. The Windsor face, that stoic, unmoving expression, is a direct descendant of the Queen's silent mourning. They learned that the best way to hide a secret is to dress it in tradition. If you make a lie look like a ritual, the public will not only believe it, but they will defend it. The archives show that the black fabric was not destroyed. It was put into storage, a dark archive of a mother's betrayal. To this day, when the royal family enters a period of mourning, they are following the rules laid down by a woman who was hiding a subterranean secret. The heavy crepe, the black borders, and the calculated distance are all echoes of the Nursery of Glass, the Tier 1. Audience can now see that the Victorian era was not a time of simple values. It was a time of complex, high-stakes deception. The Queen's silent mourning was the most successful viral campaign in history. It turned a moral failure into a global symbol of devotion. It made us look at the black dress and see love, when we should have been looking at the woman and seeing the secrets she carried in her. Pockets. As the light of the candle fades, and the rustle of the silk grows quiet in your mind, the image of the Queen remains. She is standing at the end of a long, dark hallway, her hand on a hidden door, her face covered by a veil that never lifts. She is the guardian of the lineage, the woman who wore the weight of the crown in every stitch of her clothing. But the Queen's mourning was not the only thing hidden in the shadows of the palace. As Victoria retreated into her black veils, a new discovery was made beneath the castle, a network of tunnels that led far beyond the castle walls. These were the veins of the Changeling Protocol, and they held the secret of where the discarded children truly went when they left the Nursery of Glass. This leads us to the dark architecture of the Windsor Under-Vault, and the one room that even the Queen was afraid to enter. Beneath the manicured lawns and ancient stones of Windsor Castle lies a nightmare that history has tried to delete from the collective memory of the world. While the Victorian public looked up at the spires of the monarchy as a symbol of divine grace, a horrific betrayal was pulse-beating in the dark, directly beneath their feet. This was the Windsor Under-Vault, a secret, subterranean medical facility that served as the processing center for the Changeling Protocol. Here, the spoiled heirs, the children born with the decaying blood of the royal line, were brought to be hidden, studied, and replaced. It was a forbidden place where the scent of expensive incense met the cold, clinical smell of ether and damp earth. This was not a prison, but a shadow palace, a mirror world where the discarded royalty lived as ghosts while their healthy imposters slept in silk and gold just a few feet above. The discovery of these chambers reveals a moral decay so profound it shatters the foundation of the British crown. It was a laboratory of the lost, where the state's most precious secrets were kept in iron-bound ledgers and stone-walled cells. The church sanctioned it, the government funded it, and the Queen herself oversaw the erasure of her own flesh and blood. This is the forbidden knowledge that would topple thrones if it were ever fully spoken in the light of day. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine a heavy iron-bound door hidden behind a tapestry in the Queen's private library. The air that escapes from the crack is cold, smelling of ancient stone and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. We are stepping down the spiral staircase, moving away from the warmth of the fireplaces and into the silent, eternal chill of the under-vault. To the casual historian, the tunnels beneath Windsor are nothing more than medieval escape routes or wine cellars dating back to the time of Henry VIII. But in the mid-19th century, a radical and informative transformation occurred. Under the direction of the royal adjusters, a specific section of the subterranean network was isolated and reinforced with lead-lined walls. This was the birth of the Under-Vault. The engineering required was immense, involving the diversion of underground springs and the installation of a primitive but effective ventilation system that used the castle's chimneys to mask the smells of a medical facility. The blueprints for this construction were never officially filed with the Office of Works. Instead, they were kept in a private collection known as the Black Archive. These documents describe a series of observation suites and clean rooms that were centuries ahead of their time. The Tier 1 audience should understand that while the public hospitals of London were struggling with basic hygiene, the Under-Vault was a masterpiece of Victorian clinical design. It featured tiled walls that could be easily scrubbed, gas-powered lighting that flickered with a steady white glow, and reinforced glass windows that allowed for constant surveillance. The entrance to this facility was managed through a series of double-blind rotations. The servants who brought food and supplies to the lower levels never actually saw the occupants. They would place the trays in a rotating hatch, ring a bell, and depart. The doctors and adjusters who worked within the vault lived there for months at a time, Their families told they were on special diplomatic missions to the colonies. This level of secrecy was necessary because the Under-Vault held the physical evidence of the crown's greatest lie. The psychological impact of the architecture cannot be overstated. The rooms were designed to be sensory neutral. There were no colors, no textures, and no sounds from the world above. The only rhythm was the mechanical ticking of the ventilation fans and the occasional muffled sound of a carriage passing on the gravel drive far above. For the discarded heirs, this was their entire universe. They were the shadow princes, living in a world of gray stone and white light, while the history of the world was being written in their names by strangers who wore their faces. The heart of the Under-Vault was the surgical theater. This was not a place of healing, but a place of correction. When a replacement child was brought in from the outside world, they were often taken to this room first. The surgeons, sworn to an oath that superseded the Hippocratic, would perform minor cosmetic adjustments to ensure a perfect match with the royal profile. This included the reshaping of earlobes, the removal of birthmarks, and in some documented cases, the subtle modification of the jawline through the use of silver wires and porcelain inserts. The informative details of these procedures are found in the Ledger of Corrections, a document that survived the Great Archival Purge of 1901. It describes the use of early anesthesia not just for the surgery, but to keep the imposter children in a state of suggestible lethargy during their initial training. They were taught the Windsor walk and the royal nod while under the influence of laudanum and ether. The Under-Vault was a factory where human beings were processed into symbols for the spoiled heirs who were moved down to the vault. The medical focus was different. They were the control group. The doctors would monitor the progression of their genetic decay, documenting the fading of their features and the weakening of their limbs. It was a slow-motion autopsy of a living bloodline. These children were treated with a strange mix of reverence and clinical detachment. They were provided with the finest medical care, yet they were essentially laboratory specimens. They were the biological proof that the divine right of kings was a myth, a truth that had to be contained at all costs. The equipment found in the Under-Vault was the pinnacle of Victorian technology. There were primitive heart monitors that used mercury tubes to track the pulse of the dying heirs. There were light baths designed to prevent the rickets and bone softening that comes from a life without sunlight. Everything was designed to keep the secret alive, even as the bodies within the vault were failing. The moral decay of the state was mirrored in the sterile, cold precision of the instruments. The surgeons were not just men of science. They were the executioners of reality, ensuring that the world only ever saw the perfect version of the monarchy. Imagine being a child who remembers the warmth of a mother's embrace and the taste of fresh air, only to be told that you are spoiled and must live in a room beneath the floor. The Under-Vault was filled with these discarded voices. The archives mention a room of echoes where the children were allowed to play. Because the walls were made of thick, sound-dampening stone, their laughter and cries never reached the surface. They played with silver toys and read books by the light of gas lamps, but they were effectively dead to the world. One of the most haunting informative details is the correspondence protocol. The discarded children were encouraged to write letters to their parents, the Queen and the Prince Consort. These letters were never delivered. Instead, they were collected by the adjusters, analyzed for signs of psychological rebellion, and then burned in the castle furnaces. The Queen would occasionally visit the upper level of the vault, standing behind a one-way mirror to watch her children through the glass. She never spoke to them. She never touched them. She simply watched the decay she had authorized. The psychological toll on the staff was equally severe. The journals of a young nurse named Sarah Jenkins, who worked in the Under-Vault in the 1860s, speak of the hollow look in the eyes of the children. She wrote that they stopped asking for the sun after the first year. They became creatures of the stone, their skin turning a translucent bluish white, their movements becoming slow and deliberate. They were the living embodiments of the secret, and their existence was a weight that Sarah could not bear. She eventually retired to a remote cottage in Cornwall, where she was watched by agents of the Crown. Until her death, this part of the story asks the listener to reflect on the nature of identity. If you are told you do not exist, do you still have a soul? The children in the Under-Vault were given numbers instead of names in the medical records. They were Subject 4 or Legacy 9. They were the ghosts in the machine of the British Empire. The Tier 1 audience, with their interest in the darker side of human psychology, will recognize this as the ultimate form of gaslighting. An entire generation of royalty was told that their very existence was a crime against the state. How does a facility like the Under-Vault disappear from history? The answer lies in the Great Erasure of 1901 upon the death of Queen Victoria. A special commission was formed to review all subterranean structures at Windsor. Under the guise of modernizing the plumbing and electrical systems, the Under-Vault was systematically decommissioned. The lead-lined walls were stripped. The medical equipment was melted down in the palace forges, and the rooms were filled with tons of concrete and rubble. The maps of the castle were redrawn. Any mention of the North Tower's lower levels was deleted from the official architectural records. The archives were purged of the ledger of corrections and the shadow payroll, but the erasure was not perfect. In the 1980s, during a routine structural survey, engineers found a discrepancy in the thickness of the foundations beneath the quadrangle. They found a void that didn't appear on any modern map. When they bored a small hole and lowered a camera, they didn't find a wine cellar. They found a tiled wall and the rusted remains of a gas lamp. The informative power of this discovery is that it provides physical proof for the theories that had been dismissed as conspiracy for decades. The Under-Vault was real. It was a functional, high-tech facility that operated for over 60 years. The Shadow Princes were not myths. They were residents. The moral decay of the Victorian era was literally built into the foundations of its greatest monument. The Crown spent millions to hide this, but the stone remembers. For the American and Tier 1 audiences, the Under-Vault represents the ultimate example of the deep state in history. It shows that even in an age of supposed enlightenment and parliamentary democracy, the core of power was protected by a layer of absolute, terrifying secrecy. The Under-Vault was the place where the rules of society did not apply. It was a sovereign space where the Crown could do anything to anyone to preserve the illusion of its own perfection. The shadow guests, who lived in the vault, were eventually moved. As the facility was being closed, the remaining residents were transferred to private asylums in the Scottish Highlands, places that were, in reality, extensions of the Under-Vault Protocol. They lived out their lives in comfortable but absolute isolation, the final remnants of a bloodline that had been deemed unfit. Their graves are unmarked, their names are forgotten, but the void beneath Windsor remains. It is a hollow space in the heart of the monarchy, a reminder that the price of the crown is often paid in the blood of the innocent. The atmosphere of the Under-Vault today is one of heavy, stagnant silence. Even though the rooms are filled with rubble and the doors are sealed with concrete, the energy of the facility lingers. Palace staff who have worked in the cellars nearby report a feeling of unseen eyes and a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that has no logical explanation. They speak of the sound of a bell, ringing in the distance, the bell that used to signal the rotation of the food hatches. The informative legacy of the Under-Vault is found in the way the modern monarchy handles its difficult members. The protocols of seclusion, the use of private medical retreats, and the absolute control of the narrative are all lessons learned in the tunnels beneath Windsor. The facility may be gone, but the mindset remains. The Crown is an institution that survives by its ability to hide its own decay. The Under-Vault was just the most physical manifestation of that survival instinct. As we conclude this part of the journey, think about the floors you walk on. Think about what might be hidden beneath the surface of the most beautiful monuments in the world. History is not just what we are told. It is what is left behind in the voids and the erased maps. The Windsor Under-Vault is a testament to the lengths that power will go to protect itself. It is a story of stone, silence, and the betrayal of a mother's heart. The gas lamps have long been extinguished, and the tiled walls are dark. But the secret is no longer safe. The void has been found, and the whispers of the shadow princes are beginning to reach the surface. The moral decay that was buried in the 19th century is rising like a cold mist, and the mirrors of the monarchy are starting to show the truth. But the Under-Vault was not just a place for the discarded. It was also the origin of the most dangerous secret of all, the spoiled bloodline itself. Why was the royal DNA decaying? What was the curse that the doctors in the vault were so desperately trying to understand? The answer was not found in a medical textbook, but in a ritual that dates back to the very first king of the line, a ritual that involved the corrupted blood of an entity that the Windsor vaults were actually built to contain. This leads us to the shocking revelation of the genetic decay that necessitated the Changeling Protocol in the first place. The most terrifying secret of the British Empire was not hidden in a treasury or a weapon, but within the very veins of its rulers. We are taught to revere the royal blood as a sacred, unbroken chain of divinity, but by the mid-19th century that chain was shattering from within. The forbidden truth is that the House of Windsor was facing a biological extinction. Centuries of strategic intermarriage, designed to consolidate power, had instead consolidated a horrific genetic decay. This was the spoiled bloodline, a corruption of the flesh that turned the heirs to the throne into fragile, translucent beings who could not survive the light of day. It was a curse born of ego and isolation. The royal blood was no longer a symbol of strength. It had become a thin, watery poison that refused to clot, refused to heal, and refused to grow. The Crown realized that their divine right was being erased by the laws of nature itself. To prevent the world from seeing the true children, the glass-boned, silent heirs who lived in the shadows, they had to find a way to replace the blood without the people ever knowing. This was not just a medical crisis. It was a total collapse of the monarchical myth. The genetic rot was so advanced that the only way to save the institution was to betray the family. They chose the brand over the blood, initiating a search for sturdy replacements to hide the biological decay of the throne. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the heavy, suffocating warmth of a royal bedchamber in the year 1837. The windows are sealed against the London soot, and the only light comes from the dying embers in the hearth. We are peeling back the velvet layers of history, moving past the official portraits and into the microscopic world of the royal cell. The air is still, and the weight of 1,000 years of ancestry is pressing down on the silent halls of the palace. To the outside world, the marriage of royal houses across Europe was a grand game of diplomacy and peace. But to the archival researchers of the Hidden Crown, it was a recipe for biological disaster. For generations, the royal families of England, Germany, Russia, and Spain had treated their bloodlines like a private club, refusing to allow common DNA to dilute their supposed divinity. By the time Victoria took the throne, the genetic pool of European royalty was less a pool and more a stagnant pond. The informative reality is that the House of Hanover was already carrying the weight of several recessive disorders that were beginning to manifest with terrifying frequency. The most famous of these was the royal malady, often linked to the porphyry of George III, while the public was told of the king's madness. The secret medical files describe a much deeper systemic failure, a breakdown of the very building blocks of the body. This was the foundation upon which Victoria's reign was built. When she married her cousin Albert, she was not just uniting two branches of the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha line. She was doubling down on a genetic legacy that was already fraying at the edges, the Tier 1. Audience should understand that the Victorian obsession with purity was the very thing that was killing them. In the 1840s, the science of genetics did not yet exist in the public sphere, but within the walls of Windsor, the royal adjusters were beginning to notice a pattern. They saw that the children of these unions were becoming increasingly delicate. They were smaller. Their skin was thinner, and they lacked the robust vitality of the common children they saw in the streets of London. This was the spoiled bloodline in its early stages, a quiet, creeping decay that signaled the end of a biological era. The adjusters, acting as a primitive board of geneticists, began to document the physical traits of the heirs. They noted the translucent quality of the skin, where the veins were visible like blue spiderwebs beneath the surface. They noted the brittleness of the spirit, a lack of the traditional Hanoverian temper, replaced by a hollow, vacant compliance. This was the evidence of a bloodline that had been pushed to its limit. The crown was no longer producing leaders. It was producing porcelain dolls. And in a world that was rapidly industrializing, a world of steam and steel, a porcelain monarchy could not survive. The search for a sturdy alternative was not an act of cruelty. It was a desperate attempt to survive a biological dead-end. As we move deeper into the informative heart of the mystery, we encounter the most infamous marker of the spoiled bloodline, hemophilia, often called the royal disease. It is a condition that prevents blood from clotting, making even a small bruise a potential death sentence. The history books tell us that Victoria was a spontaneous mutation, the first in her line to carry the gene. But the archival records found in the Under-Vault suggest a much more calculated and darker origin. They suggest that the mutation was not an accident of nature, but a result of the extreme inbreeding that had occurred in the previous 3 generations. The hemophilia was the physical manifestation of the moral decay. It was a literal inability to hold on to the life force. For the crown, this was the ultimate embarrassment. How could a king rule an empire if he could bleed to death from a paper cut? How could a queen ensure the succession if her sons were too fragile to survive childhood? The informative secret is that the hemophilia was much more widespread than the official records admit. While only a few princes are remembered as bleeders, the secret ledgers show that almost every male child born to the true royal line in the mid-1800s carried the mark of the spoiled blood. This was the primary driver of the Changeling Protocol. A bleeder could not be a king. He could not lead an army. He could not participate in the rigorous ceremonies of the state. And he certainly could not risk being seen in public with the bruises that would inevitably cover his body. The public wanted a symbol of strength, not a symbol of frailty. The adjusters realized that if the true heirs were allowed to take the throne, the secret of the spoiled bloodline would be exposed to the world. They had to find replacements who were blood-sturdy children who could fall and not bleed. Children who could grow and not break. The biological betrayal of the X chromosome was a weight that Victoria carried in silence. She knew that she was the carrier of the decay. Every time she looked at her children, she was looking at the physical evidence of her own biological failure. This is why she was so obsessed with the health of her family, and why she allowed the adjusters to take such radical steps. The spoiled bloodline was a mirror of her own fears. It was a biological debt that was finally being called in, and the price was the erasure of her own children from the pages of history. The physical description of the true heirs, as recorded by the doctors in the Windsor Under-Vault, is one of hypnotic horror. They were often described as luminous children. Because their skin was so thin and their blood was so pale, they seemed to glow with an unnatural light in the dim chambers of the nursery. They were the opposite of the robust, red-cheeked Victorian ideal. They were ethereal, fragile, and utterly unfit for the demands of the 19th century. The informative details of their condition were kept in the volume of Vitality, a book that was never meant to leave the palace. It describes children who could not digest solid food, who suffered from perpetual night terrors, and who seemed to possess a strange, heightened sensitivity to sound and light. These were the shadow princes we discussed before. Their genetic decay had not just affected their blood. It had affected their nervous systems. They were hyper-perceptive, reacting to the slightest whisper as if it were a shout. This made them impossible to train for the public life of a monarch. Imagine the frustration of the royal adjusters. They were trying to manage a global empire, and their primary product, the royal heir, was a child who would scream if a curtain was pulled back too quickly. The moral decay of the situation was evident. They were keeping these children in a state of perpetual darkness, both physically and metaphorically, to prevent the spoiled nature of the bloodline from becoming a public scandal. The translucent heirs were the biological proof that the age of the divine right was over. Nature was reclaiming the throne, and the crown was fighting back with lies for the Tier 1 audience. The horror lies in the clinical detachment of the reports. The doctors did not speak of the children's pain or their fear. They spoke of specimen integrity and biological viability. They were looking for a way to patch the bloodline, to find a medical solution to a genetic dead end. When they realized that no such solution existed, the decision was made to move toward the replacement strategy. The translucent heirs were moved to the Under-Vault, and the search began for children who looked like royalty but possessed the iron blood of the common people. The spoiled bloodline was to be hidden behind a facade of stolen vitality. To understand why the crown was so terrified of the spoiled bloodline, One must look at the intellectual atmosphere of the mid-19th century. This was the age of Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. The concept of survival of the fittest was beginning to take hold in the minds of the Tier 1 elite. For the first time, the aristocracy was looking at itself through a biological lens, and they didn't like what they saw. They realized that if the public began to view the monarchy as unfit, the entire social order would be upended. The informative secret of the Darwinian panic is that the crown was terrified of being seen as devolving. In an era where the British Empire was supposed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, the fact that its rulers were biologically decaying was a catastrophic threat. The royal adjusters were well aware of the rising tide of republicanism and the growing power of the working class. They knew that a weak king would be the perfect excuse for a revolution. The Changeling Protocol was their version of artificial selection. They were stepping in to do what nature had failed to do, ensure the survival of the strongest. This was the ultimate moral decay. The crown was using the language of science to justify the betrayal of its own blood. They argued that the institution of the throne was more important than the individuals of the bloodline. If the blood was spoiled, it had to be discarded. They began to look for the sturdy stock children from the remote corners of the empire who possessed the physical traits the royal family had lost. These were the Highland heirs and the Cornish changelings, children who were chosen for their bone density, their blood-clotting ability, and their robust immune systems. The psychological impact of this Darwinian approach was felt throughout the palace. It created a culture of biological surveillance, where every member of the family was constantly being checked for signs of weakness. A cough was not just a cold. It was a potential sign of the rot. A slow-growing child was not just a late bloomer. He was a candidate for the Under-Vault. The monarchy had become a biological fortress, and the spoiled bloodline was the enemy within the walls. They were fighting a war against their own DNA. And the Changeling Protocol was their only weapon. The decision to fully commit to the Changeling Protocol was finalized in a secret meeting in the winter of 1841. The informative minutes of this meeting, kept in the Iron Ledger, show that the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and the royal adjusters all agreed that the spoiled bloodline could no longer be allowed to reach the throne. The mandate was clear. Every heir born to the Queen would be evaluated within 24 hours of birth. If the markers of decay were present, the translucent skin, the high-arched palate, the specific blue of the eyes, the swap would be initiated immediately. This mandate transformed the royal family into a manufacturing line. The children were no longer individuals. They were candidates. The Queen was no longer a mother. She was a host for a dying lineage. The moral decay had reached its absolute conclusion. The state had taken control of the womb, and the secret of the spoiled bloodline was locked away in the most secure vaults of the empire. The public was given a series of perfect princes and healthy princesses, while the true history of the Windsor blood was buried in the dark. The Tier 1 audience can see the informative irony here. The British Empire was at the height of its power, yet its core was a manufactured lie. The royal brand was being sustained by the blood of commoners, while the royal blood was being hidden like a shameful disease. The genetic rot was the one thing the empire could not conquer, so it chose to pretend it didn't exist. This is the foundation of the modern monarchy. Legacy of stolen health and hidden decay. As the light of the candle flickers and the air in the chamber grows cold, we are left with the image of the volume of vitality. It sits in a room beneath the castle, its pages filled with the records of a family that was too divine to survive. The spoiled bloodline remains the dark heart of the Windsor secret, a biological ghost that still haunts the corridors of power. The truth was buried deep, but nature has a way of leaving clues in the shadows. But how did they find the perfect replacements? How did they convince the mothers of the sturdy children to give up their sons to a life of gilded lies? The answer lies in the very first successful swap of 1842, a night of fog, silver, and a desperate bargain made in the back of a black carriage. This leads us to the chilling details of the first swap and the common mother who realized too late that she had sold her child to a crown made of glass and bone. In the damp, bone-chilling October of 1842, the British Monarchy committed its most unforgivable sin against the natural order. While London slept under a heavy blanket of coal smoke and river mist, a silent carriage departed from the rear gates of Windsor Castle, carrying a secret that would poison the royal bloodline for a century. The world believes that the second child of Queen Victoria was a symbol of health and imperial stability. But the forbidden reality is that the real princess never saw the morning sun. Born with the translucent skin and the fractured vitality of a spoiled bloodline, the true heir was deemed a biological liability by the royal adjusters. To protect the divine myth of the crown, a horrific betrayal was orchestrated in the dead of night. A healthy, robust infant was stolen from a desperate commoner and moved into the silk-lined cradle of the North Tower, while the biological princess was carried down into the shadows of the Under-Vault. This was the first swap, the moment the Changeling Protocol moved from a theory to a terrifying reality. It was a cold, calculated transaction where a mother's heart was traded for a kingdom's facade. The moral decay began here, in a world of muffled horse hooves and forged birth certificates. This was the beginning of a dynasty of imposters, a lie so deep that it redefined the meaning of the throne. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the rhythmic, heavy sound of a ticking clock in a hallway where the candles have burned down to stubs of wax. The year is 1842. The air in London is thick with the smell of rain-soaked cobblestones and the bitter metallic tang of the Thames. We are moving through the fog toward a crossroads where two lives are about to be permanently unraveled in the name of a crown made of glass. The labor began on a night when the wind seemed to scream through the battlements of Windsor. Inside the North Tower, the atmosphere was not one of joy, but of clinical terror. The Queen was surrounded by the royal adjusters' men who looked more like judges than physicians. As the child was brought into the world, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. There was no robust cry, no healthy flush of color. Instead, the newborn princess was a creature of moonlight. Her skin was so thin it appeared blue in the flickering gaslight, and her eyes remained wide and unmoving, echoing the unblinking stare of the heirs who had come before the senior adjuster, a man whose name has been scrubbed from every official payroll, leaned over the infant with a magnifying glass made of polished obsidian. He checked the pulse at the neck, noted the way the blood pooled beneath the translucent surface, and looked at the Queen with a gaze of cold finality. He didn't need to speak. The spoiled markers were undeniable. The biological decay of the Hanoverian line had manifested once again. and the institution could not afford another fragile symbol. The mandate was activated instantly. While the Queen drifted into a drug-induced sleep, the room became a hive of silent activity. A special iron-lined trunk was brought in from the redundant corridors. The real princess, the child of the blood, was wrapped in heavy, dark wool, not silk, and placed inside. There was no baptism, no prayer, and no recognition of her humanity. To the adjusters, she was simply Material A, a failed specimen that had to be removed from the public record. Before the morning papers were printed, the informative horror of this moment lies in the preparation. This was not a panicked reaction. It was a rehearsed operation. The carriage was already waiting. The forged documents were already signed. The only thing missing was the replacement. For months, agents of the Crown had been scouring the remote villages of the Scottish Highlands and the industrial slums of the north. Looking for a source? They needed a child born on the same night, with the same physical dimensions, but with the iron-rich blood of the working class. The search had narrowed down to a single cottage on the edge of the Windsor Great Park, a mile away from the castle walls, in a small, damp cottage known as Blackwood. A woman named Elspeth was holding her own newborn daughter. Elspeth was a widow, her husband lost to a factory accident, and she lived on the very edge of survival. Her child was the opposite of the prince's. She was loud, strong, and her skin was the color of fresh cream. She was the picture of Victorian vitality. The sturdy stock that the adjusters craved. The informative archival record suggests that Elspeth had been under surveillance for weeks. The local midwife was actually an agent of the royal adjusters, reporting back on the health of the mother and the progress of the pregnancy. When the labor began at Blackwood, it was timed perfectly to coincide with the birth at the castle. At 2 a.m., a knock came at Elspeth's door. It was not a neighbor or a friend, but a man in a black coat carrying a heavy bag of gold sovereigns and a document that required only a thumbprint. The bargain was simple and horrific. Elspeth would be given enough wealth to live in comfort for the rest of her life, but she would have to surrender her daughter to the service of the state. She was told her child would be raised in a noble house, given the finest education, and would never know the hunger of the slums. What she was not told was that her daughter was to become a ghost, a living mask for a decaying dynasty. She was not told that she would never see her child again, and that any attempt to speak of this night would result in her immediate disappearance into the asylum system. The psychological weight of the decision is almost impossible to imagine. Elspeth looked at the gold, then at the leaking roof of her cottage, and finally at her daughter. In her mind, she was saving her child from a life of misery. She didn't realize she was condemning her to a life of surveillance and lies. She pressed her thumb to the ink, and the man in the black coat took the child. As the carriage pulled away, Elspeth stood in the doorway, the gold cold in her hand, watching the only real thing in her life disappear into the October fog. This was the moral decay of the common mother. Bought and paid for by the desperation of the crown, the two carriages met at a secluded crossroads known as the King's Oak. One carriage held the Material A, the fragile princess of the blood. The other held the source, the robust child of the cottage. The exchange was performed in absolute silence, under the watchful eyes of 4 armed guards who wore no insignia. The fog was so thick that the horses appeared as disembodied shadows, their breath huffing in white plumes that merged with the mist. The adjusters performed the final check. They compared the weight of the 2 infants, the shape of their ears, and the color of their hair. In the dim light of a shuttered lantern, the swap was completed. The cottage child was placed into the velvet-lined carriage destined for the North Tower. The biological princess was moved into the rough, wooden carriage destined for the Under-Vault. It was a moment of profound ontological shift. In the eyes of the law, the cottage child was now a royal highness. The princess was now a non-entity, a shadow to be forgotten. The informative details of the carriage ride back to the castle reveal the extreme measures taken to maintain the illusion. The cottage child was immediately redressed in the royal robes that had been prepared for the princess. Her skin was dusted with a fine, pale powder to mimic the noble complexion, and she was given a mild sedative to ensure she remained quiet during the entry into the palace. The guards were instructed to shoot anyone who approached the carriage, even other members of the royal household, for the American and Tier 1 audience. This carriage ride represents the ultimate heist theft of identity. The crown was stealing a life to save its image. As the wheels rattled over the cobblestones of the Windsor Gate, the gears of the Changeling Protocol locked into place. The lie was now physical. It was breathing. It was sleeping in the Queen's nursery. And a few floors below, the real princess was being carried through the tiled tunnels of the Under-Vault, her blue, unblinking eyes watching the damp stone walls of her new and permanent home. The moral decay had successfully breached the castle walls, and the first swap was complete. By the time the sun began to rise over the Thames, the transformation was total. When the Queen woke from her slumber, she was presented with a child who was warm, heavy, and full of life. The adjusters told her the miracle of the morning had occurred, that the princess had stabilized and gained strength in the night. The Queen, perhaps wanting to believe the lie for her own sanity, did not question the sudden change in her daughter's vitality. She held the imposter child and saw the future of her empire, but the atmosphere in the nursery was one of suppressed panic. The nurses who had been present for the birth were replaced by silent sisters, women who had been trained in the Under-Vault and were sworn to a life of seclusion. The original medical staff was reassigned to distant colonies or given generous pensions to retire in the Mediterranean. Every witness was moved, every record was altered, and the history of the night was rewritten before the ink. On the birth announcement was dry. The informative secret of that first night is found in the nursery log. One entry, written in a shaky hand and later crossed out with heavy ink, noted that the child's appetite is too great. She does not match the Queen's temperament. This was the first sign of the difficulty of the swap. The source child was biologically different from the royal line. She was louder, her digestive system was more robust, and her sleep patterns were entirely different from the previous heirs. The adjusters had to work around the clock too, manage these behavioral inconsistencies, using small doses of laudanum to keep the child in the subdued state expected of a princess. For the Tier 1 audience, the psychological tension of this first night is hypnotic. Imagine the nurses watching the child sleep, knowing that she is a stolen commoner. Imagine the Queen, draped in her black mourning fabrics, looking into the eyes of a daughter who possesses none of her genetic markers. The palace was no longer a home. It was a theater where the play had to go on forever. Any mistake, any slip of the tongue, could reveal the void at the center of the monarchy. The first swap had been a tactical success, but the long-term management of the imposter was to be a battle that lasted for decades. As the months passed, the imposter princess grew into a healthy, robust child who was hailed as the Jewel of Windsor. The public fell in love with her vitality. unaware that it was the result of a midnight transaction at a crossroads. The real princess, meanwhile, remained in the Under-Vault, her existence documented only in the Legacy 9 files. She was provided with the best care the Shadow facility could offer, but she was never allowed to touch another human being without gloves. She was the control specimen, the living proof of what the Crown had discarded, the informative legacy of the 1842. Swap is the perfection of the system. The adjusters learned that the public would accept any change if it was presented with enough ceremony and authority. They realized that by controlling the first 24 hours of an heir's life, they could control the entire history of the monarchy. This set the template for every swap that followed. The source children were always chosen from the fringes of society, their mothers silenced with gold. Their identities erased by the fog dot, the moral decay of the British line was now hidden behind a facade of stolen health. The Crown had solved its biological crisis by becoming a parasite on its own people. They were taking the best and strongest of the commoners to fill the vacancies in their own dying tree. The Windsors were no longer a family. They were a curated collection of genetic replacements, all held together by the secret of the first swap dot. As the candle flickers out in our own time, we must ask ourselves how many of the royal faces we see in history were real. The 1842 swap was the first stitch in a shroud that covers the entire modern era. The fog of that October night has never truly lifted from the North Tower. The mirrors of the palace still reflect the lies of the crossroads, and the Under-Vault still holds the echoes of the children who were born to rule but lived to be forgotten. But the 1842 swap was only the beginning. As the imposter princess reached her teenage years, she began to experience memories of a cottage she had never seen and a mother whose voice she shouldn't have known. This leads us to the terrifying discovery of the cellular echo and the secret diary of the royal midwife who realized that the blood of the commoner was beginning to rebel against the silk of the palace. This leads us to the next chapter, the midwife's forbiddance. Diary, buried beneath a rotted floorboard in a condemned East London tenement. A small, leather-bound book waited for a century to scream its forbiddance truth. This is the midwife's forbiddance diary, the only surviving eyewitness account of the moral decay that founded the modern Windsor line. The history books speak of the 1842 birth as a moment of national celebration. But for Mary Thorne, the woman who held the real princess in her hands, it was a night of horrific betrayal and cold-blooded ritual. She was not a royal midwife. She was a commoner from the slums. Chosen precisely because her life was considered expendable by the Crown, she witnessed the moment the spoiled biological heir was traded for the sturdy child of a peasant, and she saw the faces of the adjusters as they signed the death warrant of a living soul. Her diary reveals a secret so dangerous that the palace spent decades hunting her down to silence her forever. It describes the clinical coldness of the queen, the silver gold that bought a mother's silence, and the curse of the blue-skinned child who was moved into the shadows. This is a story of a woman who tried to keep her humanity in a world of curated lies, only to find that the price of truth is a life lived in terror. This is the forbidden knowledge that links the nursery to the grave. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the sound of a heavy rain lashing against a window pane in 1842, while the ink in a small quill pot begins to dry. We are entering the cramped, candlelit world of Mary Thorne, a woman whose hands were stained with the secrets of kings. The air is cool, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the metallic tongue of the Thames. As we open the book that history tried to burn to the Tier 1 audience of today, the medical hierarchy of the Victorian era might seem chaotic, but it was governed by a strict and often cruel logic. In the early 1840s, royal births were typically managed by the most prestigious physicians in the land. However, for the secret business of the Changeling Protocol, the royal adjusters needed a different kind of witness. They needed someone who was skilled enough to manage a difficult labor, but socially invisible enough to be erased if necessary. They found Mary Thorne in the parish of St. Giles, a place where life was cheap and the law was a distant memory. The informative details of Mary's selection are preserved in her first diary entry. She writes of being approached by a man in a carriage who wore no livery, a man who offered her a year's wages for one night of work. She was told she was being hired for a sensitive matter of state, and she was forced to sign a document that she could barely read, a document that she later realized was her own silence pact. She was blindfolded and driven through the twisting streets of London, the carriage wheels rattling over the cobblestones like a countdown to her own destruction when the blindfold was removed. Mary found herself not in a slum, but in the cold. Limestone corridors of Windsor Castle. The contrast was hypnotic and terrifying. The air was sterile, the walls were hung with heavy tapestries, and the silence was absolute. She was led to the North Tower where the adjusters were waiting. These were not the kindly doctors of storybooks. They were the architects of the lie, men with eyes like flint who viewed human beings as nothing more than biological assets. Mary realized then that she was not there to save a life, but to facilitate a transaction. Her diary describes her first impression of the Nursery of Glass we have discussed before. She saw the mirrors, the bolted cradle, and the surgical tools laid out on a silk cloth. She realized that the spoiled bloodline was not a myth, but a clinical reality that she was about to touch. Her hands, used to the grit and grime of the East End, were suddenly tasked with managing the most precious and most cursed blood in the world. The night of the birth is recorded in the diary with a slow, agonizing detail that is perfect for the archival mind. Mary Thorne describes the Queen's labor as a silent, mechanical affair. There were no cries of pain, no outbursts of emotion. The room was a theater of suppression. The adjusters stood in the shadows, their pocket watches open, timing the arrival of the heir with a precision that felt more like a factory than a birthing room. When the child finally arrived, Mary was the first to touch her. The description of the biological princess is one of the most informative and haunting passages in the book. Mary writes, "She was not like any child I have ever brought into this world. Her skin was as thin as the wing of a moth, so blue that I could see the tiny, fragile heart beating beneath her ribs. She did not cry. She only stared with eyes that were wide and dark, as if she already knew the dark place she was going." This was the physical manifestation of the genetic decay. We have explored the luminous child, who was a biological liability to the crown. Mary's diary notes that the adjusters did not even let the Queen hold the child. As soon as the cord was cut, the infant was taken to a side table where the magnification glasses and the obsidian tools were waiting. They were checking for the markers, the specific signs of the Hanoverian rot. Mary watched as they recorded the findings in their iron-bound ledgers, their faces showing a mix of disgust and grim satisfaction. The spoiled verdict was reached within minutes. The child was not an heir. She was in error. The psychological weight of this moment is captured in Mary's shaky handwriting. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just of the child, but of the very nature of motherhood. She saw the iron trunk being brought in, the same trunk we know would carry the princess to the Under-Vault. She saw the queen turn her face away, draped in the black silks that would soon become her permanent uniform. Mary realized that in this room the only thing that mattered was the continuation of the image. The flesh was disposable. The truth was an enemy. She was a witness to a murder of identity, and the air in the North Tower felt as cold as a tomb after the biological princess was removed. The second half of the night began. Mary was ordered back into the carriage, this time accompanied by 2 adjusters and a heavy box of gold. They drove to the King's Oak Crossroads, the site of the first swap. Mary's diary provides the only surviving commoner's perspective on this transaction. She describes the meeting of the 2 carriages in the fog, a scene that she calls the ritual of the crossroads. She saw the commoner mother, Elspeth, standing in the mist. Mary writes of the terrible stillness of the exchange. She was the one tasked with taking the healthy, robust baby from Elspeth's arms and checking her for the royal resemblance. She describes the warmth of the cottage child, the weight of her limbs, and the robust, rhythmic cry she let out, a sound that felt like an intrusion in the silent world of the adjusters. Mary had to perform a clinical evaluation in the dim light of a lantern, ensuring that the imposter was fit for the silk. The informative secret revealed in this entry is the presence of a third party, a priest who stood in the shadows of the oak tree. This confirms the church's involvement in the Changeling Protocol. Mary saw him perform a silent, inverted blessing over the swap, a ritual that seemed to sanction the lie in the eyes of God. The moral decay was complete. The state, the science of the day, and the church had all conspired to steal a child. Mary saw the gold being handed to Elspeth, and she saw the look of hollow regret on the woman's face as the carriages parted. Mary's account of the journey back to Windsor is a masterpiece of atmospheric tension. She sat in the carriage with the stolen child, the infant who would now be called a princess. She felt the injustice of it in her very bones. She knew that this healthy girl was being moved into a nursery of glass where her every move would be monitored, while the blue-skinned princess was being carried down into a tiled vault to be forgotten. Mary Thorne was the bridge between these 2 tragedies, the only person who knew that the royal line had just been severed and replaced with the blood of the poor. When the morning came and the swap was successful, Mary Thorne was not allowed to simply walk away. The adjusters knew that she was a danger. Her diary describes the final interview in a small, windowless room beneath the North Tower. They offered her a choice: a life of comfort in a distant city, or a quick death in the Thames. They forced her to drink a bitter tea, likely the same laudanum used on the imposter children, to dull her memory. And they escorted her to a ship bound for the colonies. The informative layer here is the palace's method of erasure. They didn't just kill their witnesses. They displaced them, ensuring they had no roots and no credibility. Mary was sent to Australia under a false name, her identity as a midwife stripped away. But the adjusters made a mistake. They didn't find the small, leather-bound book she had hidden in the lining of her travel trunk. They didn't realize that Mary Thorne was a woman of iron will who refused to let the truth be buried for the American and Tier 1 audience. This part of the story represents the ultimate struggle of the individual against the machine of the state. Mary lived in exile for 20 years, constantly looking over her shoulder. She writes of shadows that follow me in the heat of the sun and letters that are opened before they reach my hand. The palace had agents everywhere. The Changeling Protocol was not just a local event. It was a global operation of surveillance. The moral decay had spread from the nursery to the edges of the empire. Mary's psychological decline is documented in the final pages of the diary. She began to have night terrors, reliving the moment she handed the blueprints to the men in the black coats. She became obsessed with the fate of the two girls, the one in the tower and the one in the vault. She wondered if they ever felt a pull toward each other, a cellular echo of the night they were swapped. Her final entry is a desperate plea for the world to remember. She knew she was being silenced, but she believed that as long as the book existed, the secret was alive. The diary was lost for over a century after Mary's death in a pauper's hospital in Sydney. It was only when the East London tenement where she once lived was being demolished that the book was found in its hollowed-out floorboard. This discovery changed the entire archival understanding of the Victorian era. It provided the informative bottom-up view that matched the top-down records found in the Under-Vault. The two stories, separated by time and class, fit together with terrifying precision. Mary Thorne's account is the only reason we know about the ritual of the crossroads and the specific biological markers of the real princess. She gave a voice to the discarded, and she exposed the clinical cruelty of the Windsor adjusters. Her legacy is one of archival resistance. She proved that even the most powerful empire on earth cannot entirely erase the witness. The moral decay of the monarchy was documented not by a grand historian, but by a woman who knew the smell of the slums and the weight of a royal secret. The atmosphere of the diary is one of permanent twilight. It is the writing of a woman who lived in the shadow of a crown she knew was made of glass. For the Tier 1 audience, her story is a reminder that the glory of history is often built on the silence of the expendable. Every time we see a portrait of the robust Victorian royals, we must remember the blue-skinned girl and the woman who held her. Mary Thorne's Forbidden's diary is the crack in the porcelain, the leak in the vault that can never be fully plugged. As the candle flickers out in our own time, we can almost feel the presence of Mary Thorne. She's the ghost in the archives, the whisper in the hallway, the woman who refused to forget. Her book is a light in the dark, revealing the machinery of the lie. The palace is still there, the spires still rise over Windsor, but the diary remains, a small, leather-bound witness to the night the world was sold a healthy imposter. But Mary Thorne was not the only one who noticed the inconsistencies in the royal line. As the imposter princes grew older, the secrets of the palace began to leak out into the streets of London in a different way. A network of tunnels, ancient and forbidden, was being used to transport something far more dangerous than gold. These were the veins of the empire, and they led directly to the dark heart of the city. This leads us to the next chapter of The Secret, the tunnels beneath the Thames, and the shadow market where the discarded artifacts of the royalty were sold to the highest bidder, beneath the swirling murky currents of the River Thames lies a network of iron and stone that was never meant to appear on any map of London. We are taught that the Victorian Great Stink led to the birth of modern sewers. But the forbidden truth is that the engineering of the city was secretly hijacked by the Crown to facilitate the most horrific logistics in history. These were the silent arteries, a hidden system of tunnels designed to move the discarded heirs of the Changeling Protocol from the light of Windsor to the shadows of the city's deepest vaults. While the public walked the bustling streets of the West End, Infants of the royal blood labeled as biological failures were being transported in muffled barges and lead-lined crates through the freezing damp of the underworld. This was a betrayal of the very geography of England. The Crown transformed the cradle of the empire into a transit system for its own moral decay. Every brick in these passages was laid with an oath of silence, and every turn was designed to ensure that a spoiled prince could be moved across the city without a single ray of sunlight touching his translucent skin. These tunnels were the veins of a secret state, a subterranean infrastructure of erasure where the royalty lived as cargo and the truth was buried beneath millions of tons of river mud and industrial waste. This is the forbidden knowledge that reveals the monarchy was not just a family, but a logistical machine of deception. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the sound of water dripping from a rusted iron pipe, a slow and rhythmic echo that counts the seconds in the dark. The year is 1858. The air is cold and carries the thick, heavy smell of wet coal and ancient salt. We are descending a ladder of iron, moving away from the noise of the carriages and into the deep, breathing silence of the London under dash crust. To understand the logistics of the Changeling Protocol, one must understand the sheer scale of Victorian subterranean engineering. While Sir Joseph Bazalgette was celebrated for building the main intercepting sewers to save London from cholera, a shadow team of engineers, funded directly by the royal adjusters, was working in parallel. Their task was to repurpose the forgotten Roman passages and medieval smugglers' runs that crisscrossed the city. These were not sewers. They were clean passages, reinforced with the same lead lining we found in the Windsor Under-Vault to ensure that no sound and no biological markers could escape to the surface. The informative secret of these tunnels lies in their connection points. Archival research has uncovered discrepancies in the blueprints of several prominent Victorian buildings, including the Admiralty and the Tower of London. These buildings served as vertical hubs. An heir could be brought into the tower as a delivery of archival documents, and then lowered through a hydraulic lift into the silent arteries. This allowed the Crown to move the discarded children across the most populated city on Earth without ever using a public road. It was a masterpiece of urban camouflage. The tunnels themselves were a marvel of oppressive design. They were wide enough for a small, horse-drawn cart with muffled wheels to pass through, yet narrow enough to keep the air stagnant and heavy. The walls were made of blue Staffordshire brick, known for its extreme strength and resistance to water. For a Tier 1 audience, the informative detail here is the sound trap engineering. Every 50 yards, the tunnel would curve at a precise angle designed to swallow the sound of a crying child or a barking guard dog. The underground was a world of forced silence. The maps of these passages were kept in the Mercury Room at Windsor, a high-security office where every document was etched onto thin sheets of metal that could be melted down in seconds. If the palace were ever breached, these were the erased maps. They showed a city that didn't exist for the common people, a city of shadows, where the monarchy could breathe without its mask. The moral decay was literally carved into the earth, a permanent infrastructure for a permanent lie. Not all transport happened in the tunnels. Some of the spoiled heirs were moved by water, using the Thames itself as a highway of shadows. Under the cover of the frequent London fogs, specific barges known as the Black Swans would navigate the river. To the casual observer, they looked like standard coal barges, but their hulls were double-walled and insulated with wool to drown out any noise from within. These barges would dock at water gates hidden beneath the embankments, where the heirs would be transferred from the Windsor Under-Vault to the city's secret. ASYLUMS. The informative details of these water gates are haunting. One such gate was located directly beneath the Somerset House, accessible through a series of tidal chambers that only opened at low tide. This meant the movement of the shadow princes was governed by the moon and the sea, adding a cosmic layer to the logistical betrayal. The children were moved in travel cradles, small, coffin-like boxes made of wicker and leather, designed to be buoyant in case of an accident but heavy enough to sink if the barge was. Intercepted by the river police, the crew of the Black Swans was composed of the mutes, men and women whose tongues had been removed, either by birth or by a horrific condition of their employment. They were paid in gold and lived in secluded quarters in the docklands, their lives as restricted as the cargo they carried. This ensured that no word of the crying barges would ever reach the newspapers of Fleet Street. The Thames, the lifeblood of the empire, was also its greatest accomplice. It carried the waste of the city and the secrets of the crown with equal indifference. For the listener drifting toward sleep, the image of these silent barges moving through the fog is a study in hypnotic dread. Imagine the rhythmic splash of the oars, the smell of the brackish water, and the knowledge that inside that dark hull is a child of the blood who will never know his own name. The moral decay was fluid, flowing through the heart of the city, hidden by the very mist that made London famous. The Black Swans were the ghosts of the industrial age, carrying the evidence of a dying lineage toward a destination of absolute obscurity, one of the most shocking and informative aspects of the tunnel system was the emergence of the shadow market, when an heir was moved into the undervault or the silent arteries. Their worldly possessions, their christening gowns, their silver rattles, their velvet blankets, could not be kept. These items were contaminated by the truth of the swap. However, the royal adjusters were also businessmen, and they realized that these high-quality artifacts had value. A secret economy developed within the tunnels, where the discarded items of the royalty were sold to the highest bidders among the London elite. This market operated in a chamber known as the Vault of the Unclaimed, located beneath the old London Bridge. Here, the Tier 1 elite wealthy merchants, corrupt politicians, and even high-ranking clergy would gather to buy the spoiled treasures. They knew exactly where the items came from. They were buying pieces of a lie, and in doing so, they became complicit in the Changeling Protocol. The moral decay was not limited to the palace. It had infected the entire upper class of the empire. They were wearing the lace and using the silver of children who had been erased from history. The informative records of this market are found in the Inventory of the Invisible, a ledger that survived because it was kept by a rogue adjuster who used it for blackmail. It lists items that match the official descriptions of royal gifts, but with a terrifying note: Source Legacy 4 or Source Legacy 9. This confirms that the artifacts were being moved through the same tunnels as the children. The tunnels were a conveyor belt of human and material erasure. The psychological layer here is profound. Imagine a wealthy London merchant sitting down to dinner with his family, using a silver fork that bears the hidden crest of a discarded prince. He knows the child is currently living in a stone cell 10 miles away, yet he enjoys the luxury of the object. This is the shadow market mentality, the commodification of betrayal. The tunnels provided the privacy for this corruption to flourish. They were the dark veins that fed the greed of a society that valued the appearance of royalty over the reality of humanity. For the audience, this reveals that the secret was not just a palace secret. It was a societal one. The tunnels connected the crown to the city, but they also connected the sins of the monarchs to the sins of their subjects. The shadow market was the engine of the cover-up, ensuring that those with the most power had a financial reason to keep the secret. The silver in the tunnels was as cursed as the blood in the nursery, and it still circulates in the antique markets of the world today, waiting for someone to recognize the mark of the Under-Vault. What was the psychological toll on a shadow prince who spent his formative years moving through these tunnels? The informative diaries of the Silent Sisters, the nurses who lived in the underworld, describe a generation of children who were geographically displaced because they never saw the sun or the landmarks of the city. Their sense of space was entirely internal. They measured the world in the number of footsteps between iron doors and the change in the vibration of the ground when a heavy carriage passed overhead. These children developed a heightened sense of hearing, a subterranean sonar. They could tell the difference between the sound of the rising tide in the Thames and the sound of a summer rainstorm. They knew the city of London only as a series of echoes and smells. One discarded heir, known in the records only as Subject 7, reportedly spent hours pressed against the sewer grates in the Fleet Street passage, listening to the muffled voices of the people above. He was a prince of the blood, yet he was a parasite on the world of the living, stealing fragments of conversation to build a reality for himself. The moral decay of this situation is hypnotic and horrific. The crown was not just hiding these children. They were depriving them of the very concept of world. For a Tier 1 audience, this is the ultimate form of sensory deprivation as a tool of statecraft. By keeping the heirs in the tunnels, the adjusters ensured that they would never be able to survive in the world above. They were effectively unmaking the royals, turning them into creatures of the damp and the dark who were terrified of the open sky. The archival notes mention a sun sickness that afflicted the children during the rare moments they had to be moved across the surface. They would claw at their eyes and scream in agony when exposed to natural light. This was not just a biological sensitivity. It was a psychological break. The tunnels had become their womb and their tomb. They were the worms of the Windsor line, a secret biological byproduct of an empire that refused to let its rulers grow old or imperfect. The informative value of these diaries is that they show the humanity that remained even in the dark. The children would draw sunsets on the blue brick walls using pieces of coal, and they would name the rats that scurried through their chambers. They were seeking connection in a system designed for isolation. The tunnels were meant to be a place of transit, but for the discarded heirs, they were the only home they ever knew. The cellular echo we discussed before was strongest here, where the vibration of the city above reminded them of a life they were born to lead but would never touch. Today, the silent arteries are mostly forgotten, their entrances sealed with modern concrete or hidden behind the massive infrastructure of the London Underground. But for those who know how to read the city, the evidence remains. There are anomalies in the depth of the Northern Line and voids. In the foundations of the Victoria embankment that match the coordinates of the Mercury room maps, these are the modern ghosts of the Changeling Protocol. The informative legacy of the tunnels is found in the shadow infrastructure of modern cities. It reminds us that power always builds a second version of the world, a version where the rules do not apply and the truth can be moved in the dark. The moral decay of the Victorian age is not a distant memory. It is a physical part of the ground we walk on. The tunnels are still there, a hollow space in the heart of London, holding the echoes of the Shadow Princes and the rust of the Black Swan. Barges dot as the candle flickers out and the rhythmic dripping of the water fades in your mind. The image of the tunnel remains. It is a long, dark passage that leads back to the North Tower and forward into the unknown. The secret of the Windsor line is not just in the blood, but in the stone. And as we move into the next chapter, we realize that the physical tunnels were only one part of the deception. The true erasure happened in the art of the empire, where the faces of the imposters were immortalized in oil and gold. But how did they ensure the public never noticed the difference between the real child and the imposter? The answer lies in a secret gallery of paintings that were never meant for public eyes. These were the correction portraits, works of art that were updated every month to hide the stagnation of the changelings and the aging of the originals. This leads us to the mystery of the portrait that changed at night and the royal artist who was driven to madness by what he was forced to paint behind the heavy velvet curtains of the palace, behind the velvet curtains of the royal gallery. A masterpiece of betrayal was being painted in the dead of night. We are led to believe that the grand oil paintings of the Victorian era are honest reflections of a divine lineage, but the forbidden truth is that these canvases are the ultimate crime scenes of the Changeling Protocol. In a secret studio hidden away from the prying eyes of the court, the royal family employed a specialized team of artists to perform a ritual of visual erasure whenever an imposter child failed to grow, or when the spoiled blood of a biological heir became too visible in their features. The paintings were brought into the shadows to be corrected. This was the lie of the canvas, a systematic layering of pigment designed to hide the moral decay of the throne. The artists were forced to paint over the pale, unblinking eyes of the originals, replacing them with the robust, false vitality of the replacements. They used lead-based paints and toxic minerals to craft a mask that would last for centuries, ensuring the public only ever saw the curated version of the monarchy. This was a secret buried in the very texture of the oil, a curse that required the soul of the artist to be traded for the survival of the crown. Every brushstroke was a stitch in a shroud of deception, a visual proof that the face of the monarchy was a manufactured illusion. The history of the empire was being rewritten with every nocturnal update. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the sharp, chemical tang of turpentine mixing with the heavy smell of old wood and beeswax. The year is 1845. The moon is a thin, silver sliver over the spires of Windsor, and inside the long gallery a single candle flickers. We are walking toward a door that does not officially exist, a passage hidden behind a portrait of a forgotten ancestor, leading to the room where the truth is painted away. The secret studio of the Royal Limner was a place of high-stakes precision and deep psychological dread. To understand the informative reality of this deception, one must understand the role of the court painter in the Victorian age. Men like Franz Xaver Winterhalter were the photographers of their day. But for the Changeling Protocol, the crown required an artist whose loyalty was bound by an oath of blood. They found this in a man named Arthur Penelligon, a brilliant but impoverished painter who was brought into the palace service in the early 1840s. Penelligon was not given a public commission. Instead, he was the shadow artist, the man responsible for the nocturnal maintenance of the royal image. The informative details of his work are found in the Palette Ledger, a document recovered from the rubble of a London studio fire decades later. It describes the correction protocol, the process of updating portraits to match the physical changes or lack thereof in the imposter heirs. If a prince failed to grow in height, Penelligon would adjust the background of the painting, subtly lowering the furniture or the horizon line to give the illusion of growth. If the imposter's skin began to show the telltale blue tint of the spoiled blood, Penelligon would apply thin glazes of rose madder and vermilion to restore a false, healthy flush. For the Tier 1 audience, the concept of pentimento is crucial here. In art history, pentimento refers to a visible trace of earlier painting beneath a layer of newer paint. In the royal portraits of the mid-19th century, pentimento was a constant danger. If the paint was too thin, the unblinking eyes of the previous version would start to peer through the new face. Penelligon had to develop a specific chemical composition for his oils, adding powdered lid and ground glass to create an opaque barrier that no light could penetrate. He was literally building a wall of stone over the truth. The atmosphere of the studio was one of clinical silence. Penelligon worked by the light of a specialized magnesium lamp, which cast a harsh, white glow that revealed every microscopic flaw in the canvas. He was often visited by the royal adjusters, who would stand over his shoulder with calipers and measuring tapes, comparing the painting to the latest medical reports from the Under-Vault. The painting was not a work of art. It was a biological record that had to be falsified. The moral decay of the situation was evident in Penelligon's own journals, where he wrote of the screaming faces that lived beneath his brushstrokes. He felt that he was burying children in the paint. The psychological layer of this story centers on the uncanny effect. As the portraits were updated over the years, they began to lose their human quality. Because they were composites of different children, the original features blended with the imposter's robust health, the final images possessed a strange, stiff perfection. They looked like people, but the proportions were slightly off. The expressions were too fixed, and the eyes lacked the depth of a living soul. This is why many Victorian royal portraits have a doll-like quality that unsettles the modern viewer. It is the visual residue of the Changeling Protocol. The Queen herself was a frequent visitor to the nocturnal studio. She would come draped in her heavy black silks, standing in the shadows while Penelligon worked. She never spoke to the artist, but she would watch the canvas for hours. For her, the portraits were the only place where her family was whole. In the oil and pigment, the biological decay was gone. The prince who never blinked had been given a soft human gaze by Penelligon's brush. The translucent heirs had been given the warm skin of the commoner replacements. The Queen was addicted to the lie of the canvas because it was the only reality she could bear to look at. The informative secret of the correction portraits is the use of time-locked pigments. Penelligon realized that as the oil aged, it would naturally become more transparent. To prevent the hidden layers from being revealed in the future, he used experimental binders that would harden into a plastic-like substance. He was trying to freeze time. He wanted the royal image to remain unchanged for 1,000 years, even as the bodies in the vaults beneath the castle were turning to dust. This was the ultimate act of archival vanity, the attempt to defeat nature through chemistry and deception. Consider the portrait of the Princess Royal from 1848. Official records describe it as a celebration of her 7th birthday, but X-ray analysis conducted by rogue researchers in the 1990s revealed a terrifying secret. Beneath the layers of her pink silk dress and her golden curls lies the image of a much smaller child, one with the elongated limbs and the skeletal structure of the luminous children we discussed in the Under-Vault. The painting had been corrected at least 4 times in a single year to hide the fact that the original princess was dying while her imposter was flourishing. The canvas is a literal map of the swap. The royal adjusters were not just interested in the heirs. They also had Penelagon update the portraits of the palace staff and the high-ranking ministers who were in on the secret. This ensured a visual continuity across the entire court. If a nurse who knew the truth was replaced, her portrait would be subtly altered to match the face of the new nurse, ensuring that any visiting diplomat who looked at the gallery would see the same faces year after year. The palace was a living theater, and the portraits were the playbills. The moral decay had infected the very perception of time and memory. Penelagons' madness began in the 1850s. He started to believe that the paintings were talking to him. He claimed that the eyes he had painted over were trying to push through the leaden barrier. He began to sleep in the studio, clutching his brushes like weapons. He became obsessed with the final layer, the idea that one day he would have to paint a portrait of the empire itself, hiding the rot of the industrial slums and the blood of the colonies beneath a glaze of imperial gold. He realized that the Changeling Protocol was not just about the family. It was the blueprint for the entire British state. The informative legacy of the shadow artist is the master of the Queen's Pictures Office. While this is now an official and respected position, its origins are rooted in the management of the nocturnal studio. The office was created to ensure that no painting ever left the palace without being cleared by the adjusters. They were the first art censors, tasked with protecting the secret of the Windsor line from the emerging technology of photography. Photography was the enemy of the protocol because it was too honest. You could not correct a photograph with a brush in the middle of the night. This is why the royal family was so slow to embrace the camera. They realized that the royal face could only exist in the world of oil and artifice. The transition from the painted mask to the photographic record was a period of intense anxiety for the adjusters. They had to find ways to stage the photos to mimic the perfection of Penelagons' canvases. The lighting, the heavy makeup, and the distant poses of the early royal photographs were all attempts to maintain the unblinking, porcelain look of the changelings. The moral decay had moved from the brush to the lens for the American and Tier 1 audience. The portrait that changed at night is a study in the manipulation of history. It shows that what we see in museums is often a curated deception. The portraits are not windows into the past. They are doors that have been locked and painted over. Every time you look at a Victorian royal, you are looking at a chemical lie. You are looking at Arthur Penelagons' guilt and Queen Victoria's desperation. You are looking at the moral decay of a bloodline that traded its humanity for a permanent, unmoving image. The atmosphere of the studio in its final days was one of toxic despair. The magnesium lamps had scorched the walls, and the floor was stained with the heavy metals of the pigments. Penelagon disappeared in 1862, shortly after the death of Prince Albert. Some say he was moved to the same asylums as the discarded heirs. his mind finally broken by the weight of the secrets he had painted. The studio was sealed with brick and mortar, and the portraits were moved back into the gallery, their hidden layers hardening into a permanent silence, but the paint is never truly still. Over the decades, the time-locked pigments have begun to fail. In the quiet of the night, when the gallery is empty and the air is still, the chemical reactions continue. The lead-based whites are turning to gray and the glazes are thinning. The pentimento is returning. If you were to stand in the Windsor Gallery today with a specialized infrared light, you would see the ghosts. You would see the blue skin beneath the rose madder. You would see the unblinking eyes beneath the painted lashes. You would see the truth that Arthur Penelagon tried to bury. The informative value of this discovery cannot be overstated. It provides a biological and chemical trail that proves the existence of the Changeling Protocol. The art is the evidence. The moral decay is written in the cracked varnish and the shifting hues. The monarchy is an institution of paint and shadow, a facade that is constantly being touched up to hide the rot beneath. The portrait that changed at night is the story of how the world was taught to see a lie as a divine truth. As the candle in the gallery burns down to its final thread of wick, the image of the queen remains. She is standing before a portrait of her son, her hand touching the cold, painted surface. She knows that beneath the gold frame and the master's touch, there is a child she does not know. She knows that her real son is a shadow in a vault, while this oil-on-canvas imposter is the future of her line. The silence of the room is heavy with the knowledge of the brush. The moral decay has reached its perfection, a world where the image is more real than the person. The informative secret of the Windsor portraits is that they are still being managed. Even today, the restoration of royal paintings is overseen by a committee that shares DNA with the original royal adjusters. They are the guardians of the pentimento, the men and women who ensure that the hidden layers stay hidden. They use the latest technology to stabilize the pigments, which is often a code for reinforcing the mask. The nocturnal studio has merely gone digital, using pixels and software to maintain the illusion that Penelagon started with a brush and a magnesium lamp for the listener drifting into sleep. The rhythmic movement of the brush is like a heartbeat. Imagine the soft, wet sound of the oil being applied to the canvas, the slow layering of the lie. The palace is a house of masks, and the gallery is its most dangerous room. The faces on the wall are watching you, their unblinking eyes hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the light to change. The moral decay of the Victorian age is not a story from a book. It is a presence in the room, a secret that is still drying on the canvas of history. The shadow artist may be gone, but his work is all around us. We are all living in the gallery of the changelings, surrounded by the portraits of a lineage that never was. The truth is there, in the cracks and the shadows, but we have been trained to look only at the gold. The portrait that changed at night is the final warning of the protocol that even the things we see with our own eyes can be a betrayal of the truth. The monarchy is a masterpiece of deception, and we are its audience. Forever caught in the gaze of the unblinking heirs, the light of the magnesium lamp is fading now, and the studio is returning to the dark. Arthur Penelagon has laid down his brush, and the queen has retreated into her black veils. The correction protocol is complete for tonight. But as the oil cures and the years pass, the pentimento will rise again. The truth is a biological force that cannot be contained by lead or glass. It is a pulse in the paint, a secret that will eventually shatter the porcelain mask of the Windsors, But the secret of the portraits was not the only thing that Arthur Penelagon discovered during his nights in the palace. As he moved through the hidden passages to reach his studio, he stumbled upon a door that was never supposed to be opened. A door that led to a wing of the castle that was not on any map, a place where the air was cold and the sound of a ticking clock never stopped. This was the Forbidden Wing, the place where the royal adjusters kept the most dangerous artifact of the Changeling Protocol, a device that could measure the soul weight of a child. This leads us to our next chapter, where we explore the dark science of the Windsor soul scales and the ritual of the final weighing behind the heavy, velvet-lined doors of the palace. The British Monarchy ceased to be a family and transformed into something far more terrifying, a global corporation of blood. While the world looked upon the royal children as symbols of innocence and divine grace, a secret board of directors known as the Royal Adjusters was treating them as nothing more than inventory. The cost of continuity is the chilling, forbidden logic that justified the systematic erasure of spoiled heirs in favor of healthy, robust imposters. This was a betrayal of the most sacred bond, the link between mother and child sacrificed on the altar of brand preservation. The moral decay was not an accident. It was a business strategy. The adjusters calculated the risk of a weak king against the cost of a hidden vault and decided that a living lie was more valuable than a fragile truth. Every discarded child was a write-off in a ledger of human assets, a secret buried beneath millions of pounds of gold and centuries of tradition. They viewed the womb as a manufacturing line and the throne as a product that could never be seen to fail. This was a world of cold, clinical calculations where love was a liability and silence was the highest currency. The crown was not a heritage. It was a contract signed in the dark, a curse that required the soul of the family to be liquidated for the survival of the institution. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the rhythmic ticking sound of a clock in a room where every decision is final and every whisper is recorded. The year is 1860, the air is cool and carries the faint, bitter scent of iron and expensive ink. We are moving through the halls of Windsor, past the public galleries and into the private office of the adjusters, where the fate of the bloodline is balanced on a scale of cold. Corporate necessity. To understand the informative reality of the Victorian monarchy, one must look past the romanticism of the era and focus on the emergence of the firm. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire was the largest corporation on earth, and the royal family was its most important brand asset. The royal adjusters were the C-suite of this operation. They were not chosen for their loyalty to the Queen, but for their loyalty to the institution. They included high-ranking surgeons, logistical experts, and theologians who provided the moral cover for the Changeling Protocol. Their meeting room was not a place of comfort, but a theater of cold logic, where the physical failures of the royal heirs were discussed, with the same detachment as a fluctuating stock price. The informative secret of these meetings is found in the Minutes of the Invisible, a set of documents that describe the asset evaluation of each royal child. Within 24 hours of a birth, an adjuster would perform a quality control check. They were looking for the markers of the spoiled bloodline, the blue tint of the skin, the unblinking gaze, the fragility of the bone. If a child failed to meet the Windsor standard, they were categorized as a defective asset. The decision to swap was not emotional. It was a cost-benefit analysis. A weak heir represented a potential collapse of the divine right myth, which would lead to a loss of public confidence and a decrease in the symbolic capital of the crown, the Tier 1. Audience should recognize this as the birth of modern branding. The adjusters realized that the face of the monarchy had to be consistent, robust, and perfect. If nature failed to provide that face, it had to be manufactured. They treated the royal lineage as a franchise. Just as a modern company ensures that every product is identical, the adjusters ensured that every prince and princess was a perfect representation of the imperial ideal. The real children, the ones born with the genetic decay of centuries of intermarriage, was simply waste material in the production of the royal image. The psychology of the adjusters was one of absolute certainty. They believed that they were the true guardians of England. To them, the family was a temporary collection of individuals, but the crown was an eternal machine. If an individual broke, they had to be replaced to keep the machine running. This cold, corporate logic stripped the monarchy of its humanity and replaced it with a clinical obsession with continuity. The moral decay was the price they were willing to pay for stability. They were the architects of a world where the brand was more real than the blood. The logistics of the Changeling Protocol required a massive and secret financial infrastructure. While the public saw the civil list, the official budget for the royal household, the informative truth is that a second black ledger existed. This ledger tracked the expenses of the Under-Vault, the silent arteries, and the shadow market. It was funded through a series of blind trusts and offshore investments in the growing industrial sectors of the American colonies and the East Indies. The cost of keeping a shadow prince in a subterranean cell was calculated down to the last penny, including the price of the lead lining. For the walls and the specialized medical equipment, the informative details of the Black Ledger reveal the redemption. Fees paid to the mothers of the replacement children. Women like Elspeth, whom we discussed in the first swap, were listed as source providers. Their children were acquired assets. The transactions were handled with the same bureaucratic precision as a government contract for coal or timber. The mothers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that were enforced by the secret police of the adjusters. The ledger shows that the Crown was effectively running a high-end human trafficking ring, sourcing healthy commoners to fill the vacancies created by the spoiled bloodline. For the audience, the horror lies in the depreciation schedules found in the ledger. The adjusters calculated the life expectancy of the discarded heirs and allocated funds accordingly. If a shadow prince was expected to live only 10 years in the vault, his maintenance budget was adjusted. They even factored in the cost of final erasure, the secret burials in unmarked graves beneath the castle floors. Human lives were reduced to columns of numbers, their value determined solely by their ability to either serve the brand or be successfully hidden from it. The psychological impact of this accounting on the Queen was profound. Victoria was a woman who took great pride in her thrift and her management of the household, but the Black Ledger was a book she could never balance. Every time she looked at the official budget for her healthy children, she knew there was a corresponding entry in the secret ledger for the children she had discarded. The firm had taken control of her finances and her family, leaving her as the CEO of a company that was built on a foundation of human write-offs. The moral decay had reached the very heart of the royal accounts, one of the most informative and disturbing aspects of the cost of continuity was the involvement of the Church of England. The royal adjusters included a specialized group of theologians who developed a doctrine of the divine placeholder. This was a secret religious justification for the Changeling Protocol. They argued that the spirit of the crown was a holy entity that could inhabit any suitable vessel, if the biological heir was corrupted by the spoiled bloodline. It was the duty of the state to provide a purer vessel for the divine spirit to reside in. This doctrine allowed the adjusters to frame the act of kidnapping and erasure as a holy necessity. They were not replacing a child. They were preserving the sanctity of the throne. The informative records of these theological debates, kept in the volume of Vesta, show that the Archbishop of Canterbury was often the one to give the final spiritual clearance for a swap. He provided the prayers for the ritual of the crossroads and ensured that the imposter children were baptized with the same names and titles as the originals, effectively sanctifying the lie in the eyes of God. The Tier 1 audience will see this as the ultimate form of moral decay, the corruption of faith to serve the interests of power. The church was not a check on the crown. It was its legal and spiritual department. They used the language of grace to mask the clinical reality of the Under-Vault. The priests who worked in the subterranean facility were told that they were shepherding the shadows, providing comfort to the discarded heirs while ensuring they never reached the light. They were the moral bookkeepers of the protocol, ensuring that the ledger of the soul was as clean as the ledger of the gold. The psychological layer here is the gaslighting of the divine. The real children were told that they were unblessed and that their exile was a form of penance for their biological rot. The imposter children were told that they were chosen by God, a belief that made them easier to control and more willing to perform the role of royalty. This dual deception was the spiritual infrastructure of the Changeling Protocol. It ensured that no one, from the queen to the lowest servant, would ever feel the weight of their own conscience. The cost of continuity was the death of the soul, replaced by a cold, corporate theology of survival. The final stage of the corporate logic was the branding of the Windsor face. The royal adjusters realized that the public's loyalty was not to the individual, but to a specific visual archetype. They developed a style guide for the royal heirs, which dictated everything from the way they walked to the specific unmoving expression they were to maintain in public. This was the origin of the royal stoicism that we see today. It was not a personality trait. It was a brand requirement. The imposter children were trained to be living statues of visual representation of an unchanging and eternal monarchy. The informative details of this training are found in the Manual of Manners, a document used in the Nursery of Glass. It describes the use of postural correctors, metal braces hidden beneath the silk clothing to ensure the children sat with absolute rigidity. It describes the speech tempering sessions where the children's natural accents were erased and replaced with the received pronunciation of the elite. The goal was to create a human product that was indistinguishable from the portraits we discussed in the previous chapter. The moral decay was the transformation of a human being into a marketing tool for the American audience. This is the ultimate prestige brand. The monarchy was selling the idea of a superior race, and the Changeling Protocol was the R&D department. They were willing to invest millions in the correction portraits and the subterranean logistics to ensure that the public never saw the spoiled reality. The cost of continuity was the total erasure of the individual. Every royal heir was a franchise player, and if they showed any sign of brand drift, any hint of the original commoner personality, or any sign of the biological decay, they were phased out and replaced. The psychological toll on the imposter children was a sense of imposter syndrome elevated to a state of absolute terror. They knew that their position was conditional. They saw the shadow staff moving through the palace, and they heard the whispers of the prince who never blinked. They knew that there was a vault waiting for them if they ever failed to be perfect. This fear made them the most obedient employees in the empire. They were the C-suite children, managing a brand they didn't own, in a family they didn't belong to, for a public that didn't know they existed. The moral decay was the foundation of their identity. As the 19th century came to a close, the corporate logic of the monarchy reached its zenith. The firm had successfully managed the transition through 3 generations of changelings, and the secret of the spoiled bloodline was more secure than ever. But the cost of continuity was a debt that could never be fully paid. The informative reality of the Windsor lineage is that it is a collection of merged identities, a series of biological and psychological takeovers that have left the original family. Tree is a hollow shell. The royal adjusters eventually realized that the individuals were no longer necessary at all. The brand had become so powerful that it could survive any crisis as long as the protocols were followed. This led to the final liquidation of identity, the moment when the monarchy stopped being a family in even the most basic sense and became a pure legal fiction. The names, the titles, and the history were all corporate IP, owned by the state and managed by the board. The moral decay was complete. The institution had survived by consuming its own soul for the Tier 1 audience. The cost of continuity is a warning about the nature of power. It shows that when an institution values its survival over the truth, it will eventually become a parasite on the very people it claims to lead. The Windsors are not a family of blood, but a family of policy. They are the survivors of a century of biological and moral write-offs. The shadow princes in the vaults and the source. Mothers at the crossroads are the hidden costs of the crown. We see today, as the candle flickers out and the rhythmic ticking of the corporate clock fades in your mind, the image of the ledger remains. It is an open book, its pages filled with the names of children who were too expensive to keep and too dangerous to let live. The moral decay of the Victorian age is the air we breathe in the halls of power. The cost of continuity is the silence of the grave, and the unblinking gaze of a brand that never sleeps. But the corporate logic of the adjusters had one fatal flaw. They assumed that the spoiled bloodline would stay in the vaults and the sturdy, commoner blood would stay in the palace. They failed to account for the biological rebellion, the moment when the commoner DNA began to remember its true origin. This leads us to the terrifying discovery of the final erasure, a protocol so secret that it required the total destruction of an entire wing of the palace to hide the evidence of a changeling who refused to stay replaced. This leads us to the next chapter of the protocol, the final erasure. In the freezing January of 1901. As the breath of Queen Victoria finally left her body, a second and more terrifying death was occurring within the fireplace of her private chambers. This was the birth of the final erasure, a systematic, high-stakes cleaning protocol designed to incinerate the physical evidence of the Changeling Protocol before the new century could witness the truth. For 60 years, the monarchy had functioned as a factory of imposters. But as the Victorian era died, the royal adjusters realized that their greatest threat was no longer the spoiled bloodline, but the paper trail they had left behind. They moved through the palace like ghosts of the Inquisition, clutching iron-bound ledgers, medical charts from the Under-Vault, and the secret birth certificates of children who officially never existed. This was the ultimate betrayal of history, the deliberate burning of a family's soul to preserve the brand of a crown. The moral decay was no longer hidden in the nursery. It was roaring in the chimneys of Windsor and Osborne House. Thousands of documents, each containing the forbidden names of the discarded heirs and the source mothers, were reduced to gray ash in a matter of hours. This was a clinical, cold-blooded execution of memory, a curse that ensured the true history of the Windsors would remain a void. The state was not just protecting a secret, it was murdering the past. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the heavy, suffocating warmth of a room where the hearth has been fed with more than just wood. The year is 1901. The morning bells of London are tolling in the distance, a slow and rhythmic iron pulse that vibrates through the stone walls. We are moving toward the center of the palace, where the shadows are thick with the smell of scorched ink and the bitter dust of forgotten lives. To understand the informative reality of the final erasure, one must look at the specific logistical operation that occurred in the hours following the Queen's passing. While the world focused on the transition of power to Edward VII, the royal adjusters initiated Operation Phoenix. This was not a chaotic panic, but a rehearsed and highly structured destruction of the Black Archive. The adjusters had prepared incineration teams, men sworn to a silence that superseded even the coronation oath. These teams were equipped with lead-line satchels and heavy iron tongs, and they were given a list of specific coordinates within the palace where the most dangerous records were kept. The informative secret of this protocol is that the adjusters did not trust the regular palace staff. They knew that a single curious maid or a loyal footman could rescue a fragment of the truth from the flames. Therefore, they used the double blind burn method. One team would gather the documents, while a second team, which had never seen the contents, would feed them into the furnaces. This ensured that no single living person had a complete picture of the erasure. The moral decay was operationalized through this compartmentalization. They were turning the destruction of history into a factory process, stripping the names of the discarded children from the light of the fire before they could even be read. The Tier 1 audience should recognize the significance of the timing. The turn of the century brought with it new technologies of surveillance and a more inquisitive press. The adjusters knew that the Victorian method of seclusion and shadow would not survive the era of the telephone and the tabloid. They had to sanitize the monarchy for the modern age. The final erasure was their way of rebooting the royal brand, ensuring that the new king started his reign with a clean ledger. Every birth record that mentioned the spoiled markers and every medical report from the Under-Vault was a potential bomb that had to be defused. The atmosphere in the palace during these hours was one of clinical urgency. The fireplaces were kept at such high temperatures that the marble surrounds began to crack. The air in the corridors was hazy with the fine, white ash of 60 years of lies. For the adjusters, this was the ultimate achievement of the corporate logic we discussed before. They were liquidating the defective data of the past to protect the future value of the crown. The Order of the Flame was the final act of the Victorian machine, a scorched earth policy directed at its own family tree. What exactly was being burned during the final erasure? The informative details of the documents are found in the Destruction Index, a small scorched fragment of a list that escaped the fires. It describes categories of information that the Crown deemed existentially hazardous. The first category was the original birth ledgers. These were the primary documents signed by the midwives like Mary Thorne, containing the true weights, biological descriptions, and thumbprints of the heirs. Born in the North Tower, to have these records exist was to have proof that the current royals were not the people they claimed to be. The second category was the Source Mother Registry. This was the database of the commoner mothers from whom the replacements were stolen. It included their names, their locations, and the specific amounts of gold they were paid in the redemption fees. If a modern journalist were to find this registry, they could trace the descendants of the sturdy stock and prove that the royal DNA was actually the DNA of the working class. This was the secret that the king was most desperate to bury, the realization that the monarchy was a parasite that had fed on the health of its own subjects. The third and perhaps most haunting category was the observation logs of the shadows. These were the daily reports from the nurses in the Under-Vault, detailing the lives of the discarded children. These logs contained the humanity that the state tried to erase. They recorded the first words of the prince who never blinked and the drawings of the luminous children. To burn these records was to commit a second act of murder against the heirs. They were being erased from the written word just as they had been erased from the sunlight. The psychological layer of this destruction is hypnotic. Imagine the adjusters standing before the fire, watching the ink of a child's last letter curl and blacken in the heat. They weren't just destroying paper. They were destroying the evidence of their own moral decay. Every record was a witness to a crime, and the fire was the ultimate silencer. The anatomy of a record shows us that the monarchy was a data-driven institution. They tracked their lives with the same precision as their taxes. The final erasure was the moment they realized that their own meticulousness had become their greatest enemy. The fire was the only way to reconcile the books. The most prominent figure in the final erasure was not a doctor or a soldier, but a member of the royal family itself. Princess Beatrice, the Queen's youngest daughter, was appointed as the literary executor of her mother's estate. This was the public face of the erasure. For 30 years after the Queen's death, Beatrice lived in a state of permanent redaction. She sat in a room filled with her mother's journals, over 100 volumes of daily thoughts, and she methodically rewrote every single page. The informative truth of Beatrice's work is that she was not just editing for privacy, she was performing a psychological lobotomy on the history of the Windsor line. She used a specific type of heavy black ink to blot out any mention of the shadow guests or the Nursery of Glass. In many cases, when a passage was too revealing to be merely blotted, she would tear the entire page out and rewrite the surrounding text to ensure there was no gap in the narrative. This was the redaction of the soul. She was creating a version of Queen Victoria that was consistent with the brand, a woman of simple grief and domestic virtue, rather than the architect of a changeling empire. For the Tier 1 audience, the horror lies in the sheer scale of the labor. Beatrice spent more time rewriting her mother's life than her mother spent living it. This shows the level of commitment the crown had to the lie. They were willing to sacrifice the life of a princess to ensure the secrecy of the protocol. Beatrice became a ghost herself, a woman who lived in the past only to destroy it. She was the final gatekeeper, the one who ensured that even the most intimate thoughts of the queen were sanitized for public consumption. The psychological toll on Beatrice is evident in her own later writings. She spoke of the weight of the ink and the heat of the furnace that never cools. She felt that she was haunted by the voices of the people she was erasing. Every time she burned a page or blotted a name, she was participating in the moral decay of her lineage. She was the one who made the cost of continuity a personal burden. The informative legacy of her work is the authorized version of history, a history that is smooth, perfect, and utterly false. She provided the white veil for the mother who had lived in black crepe. And in doing so, she became the final accomplice of the Changeling Protocol. Where did the ash go? The informative logistics of the final erasure did not end with the fire. The royal adjusters knew that the physical remains of the documents, the inker, and the char could still be analyzed by forensic science. Therefore, they developed a disposal protocol that was as secretive as the burning itself. The ash was not simply thrown into the garden. It was collected in lead-lined drums and transported under armed guard to the silent reservoirs beneath the city of London, the same tunnels we explored in the silent arteries in these reservoirs. The ash was mixed with the tidal mud of the Thames, turning the history of the monarchy into a gray, anonymous sludge. This was the literal liquidation of identity. The names of the discarded princes and the secrets of the Under-Vault were dissolved into the river, carried out to the sea to be lost forever. This ensured that no future archaeologist or historian could ever recover the truth. The moral decay had been rendered into a liquid state, a contamination of the very earth and water of England. The psychological imagery of the ash in the wind is hypnotic. Imagine the drums being opened in the dark of the tunnels, the fine dust of 60 years of betrayal rising into the damp air before being washed away. For the adjusters, this was the moment of absolution. Once the ash was gone, the crime was gone. There was no longer any physical proof that the Changeling Protocol had ever existed. They could look at the new king and the healthy heirs and see only the divine right they had manufactured. The fire had cleansed the ledger, and the water had hidden the remains for the audience. This reveals the true nature of archival power. It is not just about what is kept. It is about what is destroyed. The final erasure was the moment the monarchy became a virtual reality. They had removed the physical foundation of their history and replaced it with a curated set of stories. The ash in the wind is the symbol of this transition. It is the residue of a family that was sacrificed for an institution. The informative legacy of this operation is the void in the archive, the specific gap in the records between 1837 and 1901 that no amount of research can ever fill. The fire was too hot, and the river was too deep. The atmosphere of the palace after the final erasure was one of exquisite, terrifying cleanliness. The rooms that had once held the Black Archive were now empty and whitewashed. The chimneys were swept of their soot, and the marble cracks were repaired with gold leaf. The new century had begun, and the secret of the Windsor line was locked in the only place the adjusters could not reach, the memory of the few survivors. But even those memories were fading, dulled by time and the constant pressure of the official narrative. The informative power of the final erasure is its success. To this day, the redacted journals of Queen Victoria are the primary source for historians. The void in the archive is accepted as a natural result of Victorian privacy. The moral decay has been so successfully hidden that we have forgotten it was ever there. The cleaning protocol was the ultimate victory of the brand over the blood. It turned a family of imposters into the eternal Windsors, a lineage that seems to have no beginning and no end. Only a permanent, unmoving presence in the heart of the world, dot as you drift towards sleep. Think about the flickering light of the fireplace. Think about the way the paper curls in the heat and the way the ink vanishes into the smoke. Every empire has a room like the one Beatrice sat in, a room where the truth is traded for stability. The final erasure is the story of that room. It is a story of fire, ash, and the silence of a princess. The moral decay of the Victorian age was not buried in a grave. It was burned in a hearth, and its remains were washed away by the tide. The palace is still there, and the fires are still burning in the winter. But the documents are gone. The prince who never blinked and the luminous children are now only echoes in the stone, their names lost to the flame. The final erasure was the last stitch in the shroud of the Changeling Protocol. It was the moment the lie became the reality. The crown remains, but the family is a ghost. But the adjusters forgot one thing. They could burn the paper, they could redact the journals, and they could wash the ash into the river. But they could not erase the physical remains of the children themselves. In the deepest, most forgotten corner of the Under-Vault, there was a chamber that even the fire could not reach, a chamber that held the legacy of bone. This leads us to our final chapter, where we uncover the secret cemetery of the Windsors and the one piece of evidence that even Princess Beatrice could not bring herself to destroy. This is the truth that is finally rising from the earth deep beneath the ancient limestone of Windsor Castle. Beyond the reach of the palace fires and the erased maps lies the final and most devastating evidence of the Changeling Protocol. This is the legacy of bone, the physical record of a family that was sacrificed so that an institution could survive. While the world bows to a throne of gold and watches the televised ceremonies of a seemingly eternal lineage, the truth is written in the calcium, and the marrow of the children's history was forced to forget. The forbidden reality is that the modern House of Windsor is not a family of blood, but a dynasty of the world's most successful actors. They are the descendants of the sturdy stock, the commoners who were stolen from the crossroads and the slums to fill the vacuum left by a decaying royalty. The moral decay of the state reached its absolute zenith when it decided that a living lie was more divine than a broken truth. We are taught that the crown is passed from father to son in an unbroken chain of grace. But the bones in the subterranean vaults tell a story of betrayal, displacement, and biological erasure. These are the ghosts of the luminous children and the prince who never blinked. Their remains hidden in a chamber that no king or queen has ever dared to visit. This is the ultimate cost of the crown, the total replacement of a lineage with a brand. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, steady touch of limestone against your fingertips as we move toward the final, hidden chamber of the vault. The air is perfectly still, undisturbed by the winds of the surface. We are descending into the ultimate archive, a place where the stories of the flesh are written in the silence of the bone. The candles are low, and the weight of 1,000 years of secrets is pressing down on the stone. To understand the informative reality of the Windsor lineage. One must look at the final destination of the Changeling Protocol. While the final erasure was successful in burning the paper trail, it could not dispose of the physical remains of the discarded heirs. In a small circular chamber located directly beneath the private chapel of Windsor, there is a space known in the secret manuals of the adjusters as the repository of the rejected. It is a room of exquisite and clinical horror, lined with small, marble-faced niches that look like the shelves of an ancient library. But these shelves do not hold books. They hold the skeletal remains of the spoiled, children, the biological royals who were deemed unfit to rule. The informative detail of this chamber is its proximity to the official royal crypt. Only a few feet of stone separate the shadow princes from their perfect replacements who lie in state above. This architecture of proximity is a testament to the moral decay of the era. The crown kept its failures close even as it erased them from the world. Each niche is marked not with a name but with a number: subject 4, legacy 9, shadow 12. These are the children who were born to the Queen but lived as ghosts in the Under-Vault. Their bones are the only things that remain of the original Hanoverian DNA, a biological archive of a bloodline that was too fragile to survive the industrial age. The atmosphere in this room is one of profound, heavy silence. The air is dry and carries the faint, alkaline scent of lime and ancient dust. For a Tier 1 audience, the informative value here is the forensic contrast. The bones in these niches show the markers of the royal malady, the specific skeletal deformities, and the signs of extreme fragility that were discussed in the medical reports of the adjusters. They are the physical proof that the genetic rot was real. They are the biological witnesses that no fire could silence. As we stand in this room, we realize that the monarchy is built on a foundation of discarded children. The repository of the rejected is the shadow of the throne. The secret heart of the Windsor line that has been beating in total darkness for over 180 years. If the bones in the vault represent the discarded truth, what does that say about the figures we see on the throne today? This brings us to the psychological deep dive into the royal actor. The Changeling Protocol was not just a biological swap. It was a lifelong performance. The children of the sturdy stock, once moved into the Nursery of Glass, were trained to be symbols rather than human beings. They were taught that their primary duty was to maintain the Windsor face, that unmoving, stoic mask that suggests a divine and unchanging nature. This is the world's most successful acting troupe, a lineage that has been performing the same play for 5 generations without ever breaking character. The informative secret of this performance is the training of the blood. The replacement children were taught that they were royal from the moment they could speak. They were given the names, the history, and the jewels of the family they had replaced. Over time, the imposter children began to believe their own lie. They internalized the royal brand so deeply that they forget their own commoner origins. This is the ultimate success of the protocol, the total colonization of the mind. The moral decay is not just in the kidnapping. It is in the erasure of the replacement child's own soul. They are forced to live as mirrors, reflecting back the expectations of a public that craves the illusion of divinity for the listener. This reveals a new perspective on the modern monarchy. Every time we see a royal wedding or a funeral, we are watching a curated production. The sturdiness that we admire in the royal family, their health, their longevity, and their ability to endure is the biological heritage of the commoners who were brought in during the 1840s. The royal blood is a narrative construction. A story told with enough authority that it has become reality. The actors on the throne are the guardians of a void, the people who have agreed to be symbols so that the empire doesn't have to face the truth of its own decay. They are the survivors of a century of deception, and their greatest skill is their ability to never, ever blink dead as science has advanced. The Changeling Protocol has faced a new and informative threat, the advent of DNA analysis, while the Crown has resisted any public genetic testing of the royal family. Archival researchers have pointed to biological anomalies in the official records. One of the most significant pieces of information is the concept of mitochondrial discontinuity, because mitochondrial DNA is passed only from mother to child. It should be an unbroken chain from Queen Victoria to her modern descendants. However, specialized researchers in the field of hidden genealogy have noted discrepancies in the hair and blood samples that have appeared at various auctions over the last century. The informative truth suggested by these samples is that the chain was severed in the 1840s. The DNA of the current lineage does not match the bone samples recovered from the pre-Victorian royal crypts. There is a biological jump that occurred exactly where the records of the Under-Vault suggest the swaps began. This is the genetic proof of the legacy of bone. It shows that the spoiled bloodline was indeed phased out and replaced by the sturdy stock. The Crown is an institution that has literally replaced its own engine while the car was still moving. It has maintained the appearance of the vehicle while the internal components are entirely different. The Tier 1 audience, with its interest in the darker side of history, will recognize this as the ultimate form of systemic survival. The Crown realized that it could not save the blood, so it saved the name. They turned the monarchy into a legal fiction, where the title of king is a role that can be inhabited by anyone who passes the Windsor standard. The DNA discontinuity is the chemical evidence of the moral decay. It shows a system that values the function of the throne more than the life of the family. The bones in the repository of the rejected are the biological ancestors of no one, while the people on the throne are the biological descendants of the commoners who once stood at the crossroads in the fog. This is the final inversion of the divine right of monarchy of the people, for the people, but hidden from the people behind a veil of ancient tradition. In the final pages of the Mercury Room manuals, there is a mention of a ritual called the final weighing. It was a psychological protocol performed on each royal heir as they reached their 21st year. They were taken down into the Under-Vault, into the repository of the rejected, and shown the niches of the discarded heirs. They were told the truth of their own origin, that they were the replacements, the sturdy vessels for a dying spirit. They were shown the bones of the children who had been born with the spoiled blood, and they were told that their entire life was a debt they owed to the institution. The informative purpose of this ritual was to ensure absolute obedience. Once a prince or princess knew that their existence was a curated lie, they were permanently bound to the protocol. They knew that if they ever betrayed the secret, they too would be erased. They would be moved to the vaults, and a new replacement would be found to take their place. The cost of continuity was a lifelong state of high-stakes blackmail. This explains why no member of the royal family has ever successfully exposed the Changeling Protocol. To do so would be to admit that they themselves have no right to the throne. It would be to commit symbolic suicide. The psychological weight of the final weighing is hypnotic and terrifying. Imagine a young heir standing in that cold, circular room, looking at the number on a marble niche and realizing that it could have been his own. The moral decay had successfully weaponized the truth to protect the lie. The heirs were made complicit in their own erasure. They became the jailers of their own identities. This is why the Windsor line appears so unified and so distant. They are a group of people who are sharing the most dangerous secret in the history of the world. They are the legacy of Bonin. Living form, a collection of individuals who have traded their names for the survival of a crown made of glass. The final weighing was the moment the individual died and the brand was born. A transition that occurred in the silence of the subterranean vault. As we conclude our journey into the shadows of the Changeling Protocol, we are left with the image of the Windsor Under-Vault as it exists today. The facility is mostly empty, its tiled walls cracked and its gas lamps cold, but the repository of the rejected remains. The small, marble-faced niches still hold the bones of the luminous children and the prince who never blinked. They are the silent witnesses to a century of moral decay, a biological debt that has never been acknowledged. The monarchy continues to perform its ancient rituals, but we now know the cost of the performance. We know that the royal face is a mask, and the royal blood is a story. The informative legacy of our exploration is the realization that history is a curated landscape. The final erasure and the correction portraits were successful because we, the audience, wanted to believe. We prefer the mystery of the crown to the horror of the vault. We choose to look at the gold rather than the bone. But the truth is a biological force that cannot be entirely suppressed. It leaks out through the cellular echo, through the redacted journals, and through the forensic discontinuities of the genome. The Windsor line is a masterpiece of deception, a testament to the lengths that power will go to hide its own mortality. The atmosphere of the palace is one of exquisitely maintained silence. The candles have burned down and the shadows have claimed the hallways. The legacy of Bone is the final chapter of a story that began in the fog of 1841. It is a story of stolen children, erased mothers, and a crown that was forged in a laboratory of the lost. The current lineage may be the world's most successful actors, but they are also the prisoners of the protocol. They are the guardians of a void, living their lives in the service of a brand that has already consumed their past. The moral decay is the air they breathe, and the silence is the only home they have ever known. The vault is closed, the fires are out, and the history of the Windsors remains a work of art, painted in oil and bone. The secret is safe for now, hidden in the one place where no one dares to look beneath the very feet of those who wear the crown. The story of the Changeling Protocol is a reminder that the price of immortality is the death of the soul. The institution survives, but the family is a ghost. The sturdy stock continues to rule while the true blood remains in the dirt. This is the legacy. We are left with a world where the image is the truth and the bone is the only lie. As the final echo of the ticking clock fades into the dark, we must ask ourselves if we are ready to wake up from the dream of the monarchy, or if we, too, are part of the protocol, keeping the secret alive through our own silence. The history of the world is a room of glass, and we are all the witnesses to a reflection that never changes. Sleep now. The file is closed.